In the sun-baked streets of Tumbleweed Gulch, a storm is brewing, one that smells of fresh bread and gunpowder. When the notorious Black Ridge gang rides into town, they see nothing but an easy target, a dusty frontier outpost with more saloons than churches, and at its heart, a quaint bakery run by a mild-mannered woman. Little do they know, they're about to bite off more than they can chew. Sarah, Lightning Hand McCready, isn't just the best baker this side of the Mississippi. She's the fastest gun in the West, a legend who hung up her pistols for rolling pins. This is the tale of how the West's deadliest outlaws learned that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one hiding in plain sight. As the gang attempts to squeeze the town dry, they'll discover that crossing this baker is a recipe for disaster. What follows is a story of how one woman, armed with nothing but her wits, her iron skillet, and a pair of six-shooters she swore never to touch again, will serve up a slice of justice that Tumbleweed Gulch and the Black Ridge gang will never forget. The sweet scent of cinnamon and fresh bread wafted through the dusty streets of Tumbleweed Gulch, a stark contrast to the acrid smell of gunpowder that usually permeated the air. Sarah McCready stood at the entrance of her bakery, wiping flour-covered, hands on her apron, as she surveyed the quiet morning scene. At first glance, Sarah looked every bit the unassuming baker, her auburn hair tied back in a neat bun, laugh lines crinkling around her green eyes. But beneath that facade lay a secret as carefully guarded as her prized sourdough starter. As she turned to head back inside, a commotion at the end of the street caught her attention. 3 riders, faces obscured by bandanas, trotted into town. Their eyes darted furtively, taking in every detail of Tumbleweed Gulch's main thoroughfare. Sarah's hand instinctively twitched towards her hip, muscle memory from a life she'd left behind. Instead, she gripped her rolling pin tighter. Knuckles, white against the worn wood. "Mornin', Miss Sarah," called out young Tommy, the sheriff's son, as he raced past on his way to school. "Them cinnamon rolls smell mighty fine today." Sarah forced a smile, her eyes never leaving the newcomers. "Mornin', Tommy. You tell your pa I've got a fresh loaf waiting for him, you hear?" As Tommy disappeared around the corner, Sarah retreated into her bakery. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully, at odds with the sense of foreboding that had settled in her stomach. She moved to the back room, kneeling before an old trunk tucked away behind sacks of flour. Her fingers traced the intricate design, and carved into the wood, a lightning bolt striking a 6-pointed star. With a deep breath, she opened the lid, revealing a pair of gleaming Colt revolvers nestled in red velvet. "Not today," Sarah whispered, closing the trunk with a decisive click. "Not if I can help it." But as she returned to her ovens, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed like thunder, heralding the storm that was about to break over Tumbleweed Gulch. As the day wore on, an undercurrent of tension rippled through Tumbleweed Gulch. The 3 strangers had taken up residence in the saloon, their mere presence enough to set the town on edge. Whispers darted from person to person, like tumbleweeds caught in the wind. "Heard tell they're scouts for the Black Ridge gang," muttered old Pete as he collected his daily bread from Sarah. "Ain't seen 'em myself, but Jed swears he recognized. And from a wanted poster." Sarah's face remained impassive as she handed over the warm loaf. "That's so. Well, I reckon Sheriff Thompson will sort it out if there's any trouble." But as old Pete shuffled away, Sarah's eyes narrowed. The Black Ridge gang was no ordinary group of outlaws. They were ruthless, organized, and led by the notorious Silas Blackjack Hawkins. If they had indeed set their sights on Tumbleweed Gulch, the town was in for a world of hurt. Throughout the day, more townspeople filtered into the bakery, each carrying a new piece of the puzzle. Mayor Whitaker stopped by, ostensibly for a fruit tart, but the worry lines etched deep in his forehead told a different story. "Sarah," he said in a low voice, leaning across the counter, "you've got a good head on your shoulders. What do you make of all this?" Sarah sighed, setting aside the dough she'd been kneading. "I think, Mr. Mayor, that we'd best hope these are just rumors, but it might be wise to prepare for the worst, just in case." As the mayor left, Sarah caught sight of Sheriff Thompson across the street, deep in conversation with his deputy. The lawman's hand rested uneasily on his holster, his usually jovial face set in grim lines. When the last customer had gone and the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah locked the bakery door with a heavy heart. She moved through the darkened shop, her footsteps echoing in the silence. In the back room, her hand hovered over the old trunk once more. A sharp rap at the door made her jump. "Sarah, you in there?" It was Sheriff Thompson. Sarah opened the door, ushering him in quickly. "What news, Sheriff?" Thompson removed his hat, running a hand through graying hair. "It's true, Sarah. Got confirmation from the telegraph office. The Black Ridge Gang was spotted 2 days' ride from here, moving our way." Sarah's heart sank. "How many?" "At least 20, maybe more." The sheriff's eyes met hers, a silent question. In their depths, Sarah shook her head almost imperceptibly. "I'm just a baker now, Tom. You know that." Thompson nodded, disappointment and understanding warring on his face. "I know. But if things go south, well, just remember that Tumbleweed Gulch is your home too." As the sheriff's boots echoed down the empty street, Sarah leaned against the door, conflict raging within her. The life she'd built here, the peace she'd found, it all hung by a thread. And as the wind howled outside, carrying with it the promise of violence, Sarah McCready knew that her days of hiding behind an oven might be coming to an end. The pre-dawn hours found Sarah alone in her bakery, hands working dough with practiced ease. But her mind was far from the task, lost in memories she'd tried so hard to bury. 10 years earlier, she'd been known by a different name, Lightning Hand McCready, the fastest draw this side of the Mississippi. Her reputation had been built on a foundation of dead outlaws and grateful townspeople, but with each pull of the trigger, a piece of her soul had withered away. The turning point came in Dodge City, a shootout gone wrong, innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. Sarah could still hear their screams, still see the accusing eyes of a mother cradling her fallen child. That night, she'd buried her guns and her past, vowing never to bring death to another town again. Tumbleweed Gulch had been her fresh start. Here she was just Sarah the baker, known for her tender biscuits rather than her deadly aim. She'd found peace in the rhythmic kneading of dough, in the simple joy of feeding her neighbors. But now, as she shaped loaves in the quiet dark, Sarah felt the weight of her past pressing down on her. The skills that had once made her a legend might be the only thing standing between Tumbleweed Gulch and destruction. A soft knock at the back door startled her from her reverie. Sarah tensed, reaching for a rolling pin before calling out, "Who's there?" "It's me, Miss Sarah," came a small voice. "Tommy." Sarah opened the door to find the sheriff's son, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Tommy? What in heaven's name are you doing out at this hour?" The boy shuffled his feet, glancing nervously over his shoulder. I heard Pa talking last night about you. He said you used to be someone called Lightning Hand, and that you might be the only one who could save us from the bad men coming." Sarah's blood ran cold. She knelt down, placing her hands on Tommy's shoulders. "Tommy, listen to me. That was a long time ago. I'm just a baker now, you understand." But Tommy's eyes shone with hero worship. "Is it true you once took down 6 outlaws in the blink of an eye? Pa said you were faster than greased lightning." Sarah sighed, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "Stories have a way of growing taller than the truth, Tommy. Now you best get on home, before your folks miss you." As she watched Tommy scamper away, Sarah felt a familiar itch in her palms. The urge to feel cool steel, to lose herself in the deadly dance she'd once known so well. She turned back to her work, attacking the dough with renewed vigor. But even as flour clouded the air, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. The sun rose over Tumbleweed Gulch, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Sarah emerged from her bakery, arms laden with fresh bread for the morning rush. But as she looked down the street, she saw fear in the eyes of her neighbors, heard the hushed conversations stop as she approached. They knew, or at least, they suspected. Sarah straightened her spine, chin held high. She'd faced down the deadliest gunslingers in the West. She could face this too. But as she unlocked her shop door, Sarah whispered a quiet prayer that she wouldn't have to choose between the life she'd built and the lives of those she'd come to call friends. The day stretched ahead, filled with possibility and danger. And somewhere out on the dusty plains, the Black Ridge Gang drew ever closer to Tumbleweed Gulch. The tension in Tumbleweed Gulch reached a fever pitch as high noon approached. The usual bustle of the town had given way to an eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional slam of a shutter or the nervous whinny of a horse. Sarah stood at her bakery window, watching as tumbleweeds skittered down the deserted main street. The three strangers from the day before had vanished, leaving behind a wake of fear and speculation. Suddenly, the thunderous sound of hoofbeats shattered the silence. A cloud of dust on the horizon heralded the arrival of the Black Ridge gang. Sarah's hand tightened on the rolling pin she held, her knuckles white against the worn wood. 20 riders thundered into town, their horses' flanks lathered with sweat. At their head rode a man whose very presence seemed to suck the air from the street. Silas Blackjack Hawkins was tall and lean, with eyes as cold and dark as a starless night. His black duster billowed behind him like wings as he reined in, his mount before the sheriff's office. "Come on out, lawman," Hawkins bellowed, his voice carrying the promise of violence. "Time for a little chat about the new management of this here town." Sheriff Thompson emerged, his deputies flanking him. His hand rested on his holster, but Sarah could see the slight tremor in his fingers. He was outgunned and outmanned, and he knew it. "Hawkins," Thompson called out, his voice steady despite the odds, "you and your boys aren't welcome here. Best turn around and ride on out." A chorus of mocking laughter rose from the gang. Hawkins's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Now that ain't very hospitable, Sheriff. We've come a long way and we're mighty thirsty. Reckon we'll be staying a while." From her vantage point, Sarah saw several townspeople peeking out from behind curtains and around corners. She caught sight of Tommy, his young face a mask of fear, as he clung to his mother's skirts. Hawkins continued, his voice dropping to a menacing purr. "Here's how this is going to work, folks. Every business in this town is now paying protection to the Black Ridge gang. You cooperate, maybe we don't burn this place to the ground. You resist." His hand caressed the butt of his pistol, the threat clear. Sarah's mind raced. She knew the pattern all too well. The gang would bleed the town dry, take whatever they wanted, hurt whoever got in their way. And when there was nothing left to take, they'd leave Tumbleweed Gulch a smoking ruin. "You have until sundown to gather your first payment," Hawkins announced. "We'll start with, let's say half of everything you own. Seems fair, don't it, boys?" More laughter from the gang. Sarah saw the defeat in Sheriff Thompson's eyes, the slump of Mayor Whitaker's shoulders as he stood on the steps of the town. All. As Hawkins turned his horse, his gaze swept the street, landing on Sarah's bakery. For a moment, their eyes met through the window. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine at the cold calculation in his stare. "Oh, and one more thing," Hawkins called out. "We hear tell that the Lightning Hand might be in these parts. Now that's a legend I'd surely love to meet, so if anyone knows where we might find this gunslinger, well, it'd go a long way towards earning our good graces." With that, the Black Ridge gang spurred their horses towards the saloon, leaving a wake of dust and despair behind them. Sarah stepped back from the window, her heart pounding. She moved to the back room, kneeling before the old trunk. Her fingers traced the lightning bolt carved into the wood, a symbol of the life she'd left behind. "Not yet," she whispered, "but soon." As the sound of breaking glass and raucous laughter drifted from the saloon, Sarah knew that her days of hiding were numbered. The storm had arrived in Tumbleweed Gulch, and sooner or later, lightning would have to strike. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah stood at her work table, hands moving mechanically as she kneaded dough for the next day's bread, but her mind was far from the task, torn between the life she'd built and the one she'd left behind. Every few minutes, the raucous laughter and shattering glass from the saloon would reach her ears, a stark reminder of the danger that now gripped Tumbleweed Gulch. Sarah's jaw clenched, her fingers digging into the soft dough with more force than necessary. A tentative knock at the door broke her reverie. "Come in," she called, wiping her hands on her apron. Mayor Whitaker entered, his usually pristine suit rumpled, hat clutched nervously in his hands. "Sarah, we need to talk." She gestured for him to sit, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "What's on your mind, Mayor?" Whitaker slumped into a chair, looking older than his years. "You know what's coming, Sarah. Hawkins and his gang. They'll bleed us dry and then burn what's left. We can't..." I can't protect this town." Sarah's heart ached at the defeat in his voice. She'd seen it before, in other towns, other faces. "You're doing everything you can, Mr. Mayor, but it's not enough." Whitaker's fist came down on the table, sending a cloud of flour into the air. "Sarah, we know who you are, who you were. The lightning hand." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah turned away, her hands gripping the edge of the work table. "That was a long time ago. But you could be that person again," Whitaker pleaded. "For us, for Tumbleweed Gulch." Sarah closed her eyes, memories washing over her. The weight of a gun in her hand, the rush of a perfect draw, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and then the screams, the blood, the accusing eyes of those caught in the crossfire. "You don't know what you're asking," she whispered. Whitaker stood, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm asking you to save us, Sarah. You're our only hope." As the door closed behind him, Sarah found herself moving almost unconsciously to the back room. The old trunk seemed to call to her, its carved lightning bolt a reminder of the power she once wielded. Her fingers traced the lid, hesitating over the latch. Inside lay more than just guns. It held a past she'd tried so hard to leave behind, a part of herself she'd locked away for the safety of others. "Not yet," she murmured, echoing her words from earlier. But as another crash sounded from the saloon, followed by a woman's frightened cry, Sarah knew that yet was drawing ever closer. She returned to her dough, hands working with renewed vigor. Each push and fold was a decision being weighed, each turn a possible future considered. By the time the bread was shaped and set to rise, a plan was forming in Sarah's mind. She might not be ready to become the lightning hand again, but that didn't mean she was powerless. She had other skills, other ways to fight back. And if Hawkins thought this mild-mannered baker would hand over her livelihood without a fight, he was in for a rude awakening. As the sun began its descent towards the horizon, Sarah McCready stood at her window, watching the lengthening shadows. The ultimatum's deadline approached, and with it a moment of truth for both her and Tumbleweed Gulch. In her mind, two images warred for dominance: the gentle baker she'd become, and the legendary gunslinger she'd once been. As night fell over the troubled town, Sarah knew that soon she'd have to choose which one would meet the dawn. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting Tumbleweed Gulch in shades of orange and red. Sarah stood on her bakery's porch, watching, as townspeople scurried about, gathering what meager valuables they could to meet Hawkins' demands. Old Pete shuffled past, a small lockbox clutched to his chest. His eyes met Sarah's, filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "Reckon this is the end of Tumbleweed Gulch, Miss Sarah," he muttered. Sarah's hand found his shoulder, squeezing gently. "Don't count us out just yet, Pete. This town's got more fight in it than you might think." As Pete moved on, Sarah caught sight of Sheriff Thompson making his way down the street. His usual confident stride was replaced by a weary shuffle, the weight of the town's fate heavy on his shoulders. "Evening, Sarah," he said, tipping his hat. "Thought I might have a word, if you've got a moment." Sarah nodded, leading him inside. The bakery. In the fading light, the normally cheery shop seemed somber, filled with shadows. Thompson removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "Sarah, I know we've danced around this subject for years, but I've got to ask outright. Can you? He trailed off, unable to voice the question. Sarah sighed, leaning against her counter. "You're asking if I'm going to strap on my guns and save the day, aren't you, Tom?" The sheriff nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I've heard the stories. Sarah, hell, I've seen the wanted posters. The lightning hand wasn't just fast. She was smart, tactical. If anyone could outmaneuver Hawkins, it'd be you." "Those stories are in the past," Sarah replied, her voice tight. "I hung up my guns for a reason." "And what about now?" Thompson pressed. "Ain't there a reason to take them up again?" Before Sarah could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. They rushed to the window to see Hawkins and his gang riding down the main street, torches in hand. "Time's up, folks," Hawkins bellowed, his voice carrying a note of cruel anticipation. "Bring out what you owe, or we start lighting things up." Sarah's fists clenched at her sides as she watched her neighbors emerge from their homes and businesses, arms laden with their hard-earned possessions, the defeat in their eyes, the slump of their shoulders. It was all too familiar. "I can't be what I was, Tom," Sarah said quietly, her eyes never leaving the scene outside. "But that doesn't mean I'll stand by and watch this town fall." Thompson looked at her sharply. "What are you planning, Sarah?" A small, tight smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Let's just say Hawkins might find that taking Tumbleweed Gulch won't be as easy as he thinks. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got some baking to do." As the sheriff left, confusion evident on his face, Sarah moved with purpose through her shop. She gathered ingredients, not for bread or pastries, but for something altogether different. In the back room, she hesitated before the old trunk once more. This time she opened it, but instead of reaching for the guns nestled within, she retrieved a small leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with more than recipes. They contained the accumulated knowledge of a life spent outsmarting outlaws and protecting the innocent. As night fell fully over Tumbleweed Gulch, Sarah worked by lamplight, her hands mixing and measuring with practiced ease. Outside, Hawkins and his gang celebrated their easy victory, unaware that in a humble bakery, plans were being set in motion that would soon turn their world upside down. Sarah's eyes glinted in the flickering light, a spark of the lightning hand's determination shining through. She might not be ready to draw her guns, but Sarah McCready was far from defenseless, and come morning, the Black Ridge Gang would learn that crossing this baker was a recipe for disaster. Dawn broke over Tumbleweed Gulch, revealing the aftermath of the Black Ridge Gang's first night of occupation. Broken windows littered the street, and the acrid smell of smoke hung in the air from small fires set as examples to those who had been slow to pay. Sarah emerged from her bakery, a large covered basket in her arms. Her eyes scanned the street, taking in the damage and the dejected faces of her neighbors. But beneath her calm exterior, a plan was already in motion. She made her way to the saloon, where Hawkins and his men had set up their base of operations. The sounds of raucous laughter and breaking furniture spilled out into the street. Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed through the swinging doors. The noise died down as all eyes turned to her. Hawkins sat at a table in the center, his boots propped, up a bottle of whiskey in hand. "Well, well," he drawled, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "If it ain't the town baker. Come to pay your respects, sweetheart?" Sarah forced a smile, setting her basket on the table. "Thought you boys might be hungry after your long night. Brought you some of my famous sweet rolls." Hawkins eyed her suspiciously before lifting the cloth covering the basket. The smell of freshly baked pastries filled the air, causing several of the gang members to lean in eagerly. "Mighty thoughtful of you," Hawkins said, his tone mocking. "Boys, dig in. Show the little lady how much we appreciate her hospitality." The gang didn't need to be told twice. They descended on the basket, grabbing at the sweet rolls with greedy hands. Sarah watched, her face a mask of polite interest, as they devoured her offering. It didn't take long for the effects to set in. First one, then another of Hawkins' men began to shift uncomfortably, their faces taking on a greenish tinge. Suddenly, one of them bolted for the door, hand clamped over his mouth. Chaos erupted in the saloon, as more of the gang succumbed to violent stomach cramps and nausea. Hawkins, who hadn't partaken, looked from his afflicted men to Sarah, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "You," he snarled, rising from his chair. "What did you do?" Sarah met his gaze coolly. "Must be something you boys ate. Shame, really. I've always prided myself on my cooking." Before Hawkins could respond, another wave of groans filled the air. Half his gang was now incapacitated, either slumped over tables or racing for the outhouses. Behind the saloon, Sarah turned to leave, pausing at the door to look back at Hawkins. "Oh, and Mr. Hawkins, consider this a friendly warning. Tumbleweed Gulch doesn't take kindly to bullies." With that, she strode out into the morning sunlight, leaving behind a scene of misery and confusion. As she walked back to her bakery, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't quite the lightning-fast draw she was once known for, but it was a start. Word spread quickly through the town. By midday, everyone had heard how the humble baker had single-handedly laid low half of the dreaded Black Ridge gang. Whispers of hope began to circulate, along with speculation about what Sarah might do next. Back in her shop, Sarah pored over her old journal, concocting new recipes both culinary and strategic. She knew Hawkins wouldn't take this humiliation lightly. The real battle was just beginning. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah caught sight of Tommy, peering through her window, his young face alight with excitement. She waved him in, smiling at his barely contained enthusiasm. "Miss Sarah," he burst out. "Is it true? Did you really poison the whole gang?" Sarah's expression turned serious. "Not poison, Tommy. Just a little something to upset their stomachs. And I don't want you getting any ideas about being a hero. You hear me? This isn't a game." Tommy nodded solemnly, but his eyes still shone with admiration. "Pa says this is just the beginning. Says you're going to run them clean out of town." As the boy scampered off, Sarah's smile faded. She knew that a few upset stomachs wouldn't be enough to drive Hawkins away. The gang leader would retaliate, and when he did, it would be with all the brutality he was infamous for. Sarah's hand drifted to the old trunk in the corner. Not yet, she thought, but soon. Very soon. Outside, the town buzzed with renewed energy. For the first time since the Black Ridge gang had ridden in, there was a glimmer of hope in Tumbleweed Gulch. And at the center of it all stood a humble baker, her hands dusted with flour instead of gunpowder, ready to serve up another slice of justice. The afternoon sun beat down on Tumbleweed Gulch, its heat intensifying the acrid smell of fear and desperation that hung over the town. Sarah stood before the gathered townspeople in the church, the only place large enough to hold them all. Faces both familiar and dear to her looked back, a mixture of hope and doubt etched in their features. "Folks," Sarah began, her voice carrying to the back of the room, "I know you're scared. I know you're thinking about packing up and leaving everything you've built here, but I'm asking you to stand your ground." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Old Pete spoke up, his voice quavering, "But Miss Sarah, you saw what they did last night, and that was just a taste. We ain't got the means to fight back." Sarah's eyes scanned the room, meeting each gaze in turn. "We may not have guns or numbers on our side, but we have something Hawkins and his gang don't. We have a community. We have each other." Mayor Whitaker stepped forward, wringing his hat in his hands. "Sarah's right. What happened at the saloon this morning proves that we're not helpless. We can fight back in our own way and get ourselves killed." Someone called out from the back. Sarah's voice took on a steely edge, a hint of the lightning hand breaking through. "No one's asking you to take up arms, but each of you has skills, knowledge of this town that Hawkins doesn't. We can use that." She began to pace, her mind racing with plans. "Mrs. Johnson, your quilting circle knows every piece of gossip in this town. You could be our eyes and ears, tracking the gang's movements." The elderly woman straightened, a glint of determination in her eye. "We can do that, sure enough. And Mr. Watkins," Sarah continued, turning to the town's blacksmith, "you know every horse in these parts. Maybe some of the gang's mounts could use some special shoes, ones that might come loose at just the wrong moment." Watkins nodded slowly, a grim smile spreading across his face. As Sarah spoke, she could see the change in the room. Fear was giving way to resolve, despair to determination. These were good people, hard-working folk who had carved a life out of the unforgiving West. They weren't about to let it all be taken away without a fight. "It won't be easy," Sarah cautioned. "Hawkins and his men are dangerous, but if we work together, if we use our wits and our knowledge of this town, we can make Tumbleweed Gulch a place they'll regret ever setting foot in." Sheriff Thompson stood up, his hand resting on his pistol. "I'll do my part to keep folks safe, but Sarah's right. This has to be a town effort. We all need to chip in." As the meeting broke up, Sarah could hear the buzz of conversation, see the furtive glances and nods exchanged between neighbors. Plans were already being made, alliances formed. Tommy tugged at her sleeve, his young face serious. "What can I do, Miss Sarah? I want to help too." Sarah knelt down, placing her hands on the boy's shoulders. "You can be our messenger, Tommy. Quick and quiet, getting word to folks without the gang noticing. Think you can handle that?" The boy's chest puffed out with pride. "Yes, ma'am. You can count on me." As Sarah watched the townspeople file out of the church, a mix of emotions washed over her, pride in their courage, fear for their safety, and underneath it all, a growing certainty that sooner or later she would have to become the lightning hand once more. But for now, Sarah the baker had rallied her town. It wasn't guns or badges that would save Tumbleweed Gulch. It was the spirit of its people, their determination to stand together against the storm that threatened to tear them apart. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, Sarah knew that the real battle was just beginning. Hawkins wouldn't take this lying down. His retaliation would be swift and brutal. As night fell over Tumbleweed Gulch, Sarah found herself alone in her bakery, the weight of the town's expectations heavy on her shoulders. The events of the day had stirred up memories she'd long tried to bury, ghosts of a past life that now seemed to whisper from every shadow. With a heavy sigh, she moved to the back room and knelt before the old trunk. Her fingers traced the carved lightning bolt, a symbol of the legend she'd once been. Slowly, almost reverently, she opened the lid. The smell of gun oil and leather wafted up, achingly familiar. Sarah lifted out her twin Colt revolvers, their weight both comforting and terrifying in her hands. She hadn't held them in years, but her fingers curled around the grips as if no time had passed at all. As she examined the weapons, checking their mechanisms with practiced ease, memories flooded back. The dusty streets of Dodge City, the blazing sun of the Arizona Territory, the fearful whispers of outlaws who spoke her name like a curse. She remembered the day she'd earned her nickname. 5 men had tried to rob the bank in Silver Creek. Sarah had taken them all down before they could even clear their holsters, her hands moving faster than the eye could follow. Like lightning, the awestruck townsfolk had said, but with the triumphs came the darker memories, the faces of those she'd killed, some deserving, others caught in the crossfire, the weight of lives ended by her bullets, the responsibility that came with being judge, jury, and executioner. Sarah closed her eyes, recalling the fateful day in Dodge City that had led her to hang up her guns. A shootout gone wrong, innocent bystanders caught in the chaos. She could still hear the screams, still see the accusing, eyes of a mother cradling her fallen child. That day, she'd vowed never to bring death to another town. She'd buried her guns and her past, seeking redemption in the simple life of a baker. But now, as she held her revolvers once more, Sarah felt the pull of her old life. The town needed her, not as a baker, but as the lightning hand. Could she become that person again without losing herself to the violence? A soft knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Quickly, she replaced the guns in the trunk and moved to answer it. Sheriff Thompson stood there, his face grave. "Sarah, we've got trouble. Hawkins' men are tearing up the saloon, demanding to know who was behind this morning's incident. They're threatening to start burning down buildings if no one talks." Sarah's jaw clenched. She'd known retaliation would come, but not this swiftly or severely. "What are you going to do?" Thompson asked, the unspoken question hanging between them. Was this the moment the lightning hand would return? Sarah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "For now, we stick to the plan. Rally the townspeople, just like we discussed. But Tom," she added, her voice low, "if things get worse, if innocent lives are truly in danger." She trailed off, but Thompson nodded, understanding. "I'll do what I can to keep things contained. But Sarah, if it comes to that, if you have to, we've got your back. The whole town does." As the sheriff hurried off into the night, Sarah stood in her doorway, watching the flickering lights of the distant saloon. The sounds of breaking glass and angry shouts carried on the wind. She glanced back at the trunk in her back room, knowing that inside lay not just guns, but a decision that would change everything. The lightning hand had been laid to rest for good reason. Bringing her back could save the town, but at what cost to Sarah's soul? As she closed the door and prepared to face whatever the night might bring, Sarah McCready found herself caught between two worlds. The peaceful life she'd built and the violent past she'd left behind were colliding, and in the middle stood a humble baker with the power to unleash a storm. The ghosts of her past swirled around her, both warning and urging. And as the chaos in Tumbleweed Gulch grew, Sarah knew that sooner or later she would have to choose which voice to heed. As dawn broke over Tumbleweed Gulch, Sarah was already hard at work in her bakery. But today, she wasn't just preparing bread and pastries. With grim determination, she was crafting a different kind of recipe, one that would give the town a fighting chance against Hawkins and his gang. Her old journal lay open on the counter, its pages filled with more than just baking instructions. Years of outsmarting outlaws had taught Sarah that sometimes the most effective weapons were the ones no one suspected. "Let's see how Hawkins likes a taste of his own medicine," Sarah muttered, mixing a batch of her special sleep powder, a harmless but potent concoction that would send even the toughest outlaw into a deep slumber. As she worked, Sarah's mind raced with plans. The town was counting on her, not just for her legendary gun skills, but for her wit and cunning. She'd rallied them, given them hope, but now it was time to back that hope with action. A soft knock at the back door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Tommy, his young face a mixture of excitement and fear. "Miss Sarah," he whispered, glancing around nervously. "I got news. Hawkins' men, they're planning something big for tonight. Heard them talking about making an example, showing the town what happens to folks who don't fall in line." Sarah's jaw clenched. "You did good, Tommy. Now get on home, quick as you can. And remember, stay inside, no matter what I hear. Tommy." "Finished?" "Yes, ma'am." As the boy scampered off, Sarah turned back to her work with renewed urgency. Her hands moved swiftly, preparing not just her special powders and potions, but also more mundane items, flour bombs that could blind an attacker, rolling pins weighted to serve as clubs, even pies with crusts so hard they could knock a man unconscious. Each item was carefully placed in baskets, ready to be distributed to key locations around town. Sarah had spent years learning every nook and cranny of Tumbleweed Gulch, and now that knowledge would serve them all. As the morning wore on, trusted, townspeople began to filter in through the back door. Mrs. Johnson from the quilting circle, Mr. Watkins, the blacksmith, even young Billy from the stables. Each received instructions and a basket of Sarah's special baked goods, their eyes widening as she explained their uses. "Remember," Sarah cautioned each of them, "we're not looking to kill anyone. Just give them a reason to think twice about staying in Tumbleweed Gulch." By midday, Sarah's secret arsenal was distributed throughout the town. Flour bombs hidden in flower pots, sleep powder disguised as sugar in the saloon, waited rolling. Pins tucked behind bar counters. Every piece of her plan was in place, ready to be activated at a moment's notice. As she wiped flour from her hands, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the window. For a moment she hardly recognized herself. The mild-mannered baker was still there, but behind her eyes burned the fierce determination of the lightning hand. She hadn't drawn her guns yet, but Sarah realized that in many ways she had already become the person she used to be, the strategist, the protector, the woman who refused to let evil men prey on the innocent. A commotion outside drew her attention. Hawkins and a group of his men were riding down the main street, their faces dark with anger. As they passed the bakery, Hawkins's eyes met Sarah's, and in that moment she knew that he suspected her role in the town's newfound resistance. Sarah held his gaze, unflinching. Let him wonder, she thought. Let him worry about what else this a simple baker might be capable of. As Hawkins and his men disappeared down the street, Sarah took a deep breath. The real test was yet to come. Tonight, Hawkins would make his move, and Tumbleweed Gulch would have to be ready. She glanced at the old trunk in the corner, knowing that inside lay her true weapons. But for now, Sarah was content to fight with flour and sugar, with wit and gunning. The guns would be a last resort, a line she still hoped she wouldn't have to cross. As the sun began its descent towards the horizon, Sarah stood in her bakery, surrounded by the tools of her trade, both old and new. She was no longer just Sarah the baker, nor was she fully the lightning hand. She was something in between, a protector armed with rolling pins and revolvers, flour bombs and 6 shooters. And as night fell over Tumbleweed Gulch, Sarah McCready prepared to serve Hawkins and his gang a dish they would never forget: revenge. best served with a side of her secret recipe for justice. As night settled over Tumbleweed Gulch, an uneasy quiet blanketed the town. The streets were empty, save for the occasional patrol of Hawkins's men, their spurs jingling ominously in the darkness. Behind locked doors and shuttered windows, the townsfolk waited, a mixture of fear and anticipation pulsing through the community. Sarah stood at her bakery window, watching. Her preparations were complete, her plans set in motion, but doubt gnawed at her. Had she done enough? Had she asked too much of these people who had welcomed her, given her a home and a chance at a peaceful life? A soft knock at her back door broke her reverie. She opened it to find Mayor Whitaker, his usually pristine suit rumpled, his face etched with worry. "Sarah," he said in a low voice, glancing nervously over his shoulder, "we've got a problem. The town, it's splitting apart." Sarah ushered him inside, brow furrowed. "What do you mean, splitting apart?" Whitaker slumped into a chair, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Some folks, they're saying we should just give Hawkins what he wants. That fighting back will only make things worse. Others are ready to take up arms, to meet violence with violence. They're arguing in the streets, neighbor against neighbor." Sarah's heart sank. She had rallied the town, given them hope. But she hadn't anticipated this. The fear and pressure fracturing the first rays of dawn were just beginning to paint the sky when a cloud of dust on the horizon caught Sarah's attention. She stood on her bakery porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, watching as a lone rider approached Tumbleweed Gulch. As the figure drew closer, Sarah's grip on her mug tightened. The glint of a silver star on the rider's chest confirmed her suspicions. The U.S. Marshal had arrived. Marshal John Iron Jack Hawkins, no relation to the outlaw currently terrorizing the town, was a legend in his own right. Known for his unwavering dedication to the law and his ability to bring order to even the most chaotic situations, Iron Jack's arrival in Tumbleweed Gulch was both a relief and a complication. Sarah watched as the marshal rode directly to the sheriff's office, his face grim and purposeful. She knew it wouldn't be long before he came looking for her. Sure enough, within the hour, a knock sounded at her door. Sarah opened it to find Iron Jack standing there, his weathered face unreadable. "Miss McCready," he said, tipping his hat. "Mind if I come in? Think it's time we had us a talk." Sarah nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. As Iron Jack settled into a chair, his eyes scanned the bakery, no doubt noting the subtle signs of Sarah's preparations. The slightly off-center rug concealing her hidden trunk, the rolling pins just a bit too heavy to be ordinary baking tools. "Quite a situation you've got here," Iron Jack began, his voice gravelly from years of trail dust. "Whole towns in an uproar, got outlaws running amok, citizens taking up arms, and right in the middle of it all, I find the lightning hand herself." Pretending to be a simple baker, Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I'm not pretending, Marshal. I am a baker, have been for years now." Iron Jack leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Maybe so, but word is, you're also the one rallying this town to fight back against Silas Hawkins and his gang. That true?" "I'm just trying to protect my home," Sarah replied carefully. The marshal nodded slowly. "Admirable. But here's the thing, Miss McCready. I've got a job to do. Law says I need to bring in Silas Hawkins and his men. Law also says I can't have civilians taking matters into their own hands, no matter how justified they might feel." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She'd known this moment might come, but facing it was another matter entirely. "So what now?" "Marshal," she asked, her voice steady, despite the turmoil in her heart, "you going to arrest me, the whole town?" Iron Jack sighed, suddenly looking every one of his years. "That's the dilemma, ain't it? By the letter of the law I should, but law's a funny thing out here in the territories. Sometimes what's right and what's legal don't always line up neat and tidy." He stood, moving to the window to look out at the town stirring to life. "I've heard tales of the lightning hand. How she brought justice to places the law couldn't reach. How she protected the innocent when no one else would. Always reckoned those stories were too good to be true." Turning back to Sarah, Iron Jack's expression softened slightly. "But seeing you here, seeing what you've done for this town, well, maybe there's some truth to them after all." Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. "So what are you saying, Marshal?" I'm saying, Iron Jack replied slowly, that maybe there's a way. We can work together on this. You know this town, know these people. And if even half the stories about you are true, you've got skills that could be mighty useful in bringing down Silas and his gang. He held up a hand as Sarah began to speak. But let me be clear, this has to be done by the book, or at least as close to it as we can manage out here. No vigilante justice, no taking the law into your own hands. You work with me under my authority. Understood? Sarah considered his words carefully. Working with Iron Jack would give her actions legitimacy, potentially protect the townsfolk from legal repercussions, but it would also mean giving up some control, potentially limiting her ability to do what needed to be done. After a long moment, Sarah nodded. Understood, Marshal. So, where do we start? Iron Jack's face broke into a grim smile. We start by letting Silas Hawkins know that the U.S. Marshal Service has come to Tumbleweed Gulch. And then, Miss McCready, you and I are going to plan one hell of a welcoming committee for him and his boys. As the Marshal left to make his presence known in town, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. But as she turned back to her baking, preparing for another day of secret planning and subtle resistance, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real test was yet to come. The arrival of Marshal Iron Jack had changed the game. Now, Sarah had to find a way to save Tumbleweed Gulch while walking the fine line between justice and the law. It was a challenge the Lightning Hand had never faced before, but one that Sarah McCready was determined to meet head-on. The full moon hung low over Tumbleweed Gulch, casting long shadows across the deserted streets. In the eerie silence, Sarah crouched behind a water trough, her eyes scanning the darkness. Beside her, Marshal Iron Jack checked his revolver one last time. "You sure about this, McCready?" he whispered, his breath misting in the cool night air. Sarah nodded, her focus unwavering. "Hawkins's men always send out a midnight patrol. They'll be coming down this street any minute now." As if on cue, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached their ears. Sarah tensed, her hand instinctively moving to her hip where her own revolver now sat, a concession to Iron Jack's insistence that she be properly armed. "Remember," Iron Jack murmured, "we're just gathering intelligence, no engaging unless absolutely necessary." Sarah bit back a retort. She'd been the one to suggest this reconnaissance mission after all. But Iron Jack's constant reminders of who was in charge were starting to grate on her nerves. The hoofbeats grew louder, and soon 4 of Hawkins' men came into view, their horses moving at a leisurely trot. Sarah recognized 2 of them, Butch and Lefty, Hawkins' most trusted lieutenants. As the riders passed their hiding spot, Sarah strained to catch their conversation. "A day boss says we move on the bank tomorrow night," Butch was saying. "Gonna clean this town out once and for all." Lefty chuckled, a harsh sound in the quiet night. "About time. I'm getting tired of this place. Say, you heard anything more about that Lightning Hand character? Boss seems awful spooked by the idea of her being here." "Oh, it's just stories," Butch scoffed. "Ain't no way some legend from the old days is hiding out in this backwater. Boss is just being cautious is all." As their voices faded into the distance, Sarah and Iron Jack shared a look. This was the information they'd been waiting for. Hawkins' next move laid out plain as day. "We need to warn the town," Sarah whispered urgently. "Get everyone prepared for—" Her words were cut short by a sudden commotion further down the street. A scream pierced the night, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Without hesitation, Sarah was on her feet, racing towards the sound. She heard Iron Jack curse behind her, but she didn't slow down. Someone was in trouble, and every instinct she had was screaming at her to help. As she rounded the corner, Sarah saw 2 more of Hawkins's men dragging a struggling figure from a house. With a jolt, she recognized Tommy, the sheriff's young son. "Let him go," she shouted, her voice ringing out in the night. The outlaws turned, surprise quickly giving way to menace as they recognized her. One of them, a scarred brute named Cutter, grinned wickedly. "Well, well," he drawled, "if it ain't the town's pet baker. Come to offer us some cookies, sweetheart." Sarah's eyes narrowed, her hand hovering near her gun. "I said, let the boy go, now." Cutter's grin widened as he shoved Tommy towards his partner. "Boys, I think we just found our ticket to making the sheriff real cooperative-like. Grab her." Time seemed to slow as Cutter reached for his gun. Sarah felt a familiar calm settle over her, the world narrowing to just her, the outlaw, and the space between them. Her draw was lightning fast, living up to her old moniker. Before Cutter could clear his holster, Sarah's bullet found its mark, sending his gun flying from his hand. The other outlaw, still holding Tommy, froze in shock. Sarah's gun swiveled to him, her voice cold as steel. "Your turn, mister. Let the boy go, or the next shot won't be so gentle." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then slowly, the outlaw released his grip on Tommy. The boy didn't waste a second running to Sarah and hiding behind her. "You're gonna regret this," Cutter snarled, cradling his injured hand. "When Hawkins hears about this, Hawkins ain't gonna hear about nothing." Iron Jack's voice boomed as he rounded the corner, his badge glinting in the moonlight. "You boys are under arrest." With the marshal there to back her up, the fight went out of the outlaws. As Iron Jack cuffed them, Sarah knelt down to check on Tommy. "You all right, son?" she asked gently. Tommy nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "That was amazing, Miss Sarah. You really are the lightning hand, ain't you?" Sarah smiled sadly, ruffling the boy's hair. "That's a story for another time, Tommy. Let's get you home to your pa." As they walked Tommy back to the sheriff's house, Iron Jack fell into step beside Sarah. "That was some fancy shooting back there, McCready. Guess the stories about you weren't exaggerated after all." Sarah didn't respond, her mind already racing ahead. Her cover was well and truly blown now. Hawkins would know by morning that the lightning hand was indeed in Tumbleweed Gulch. The stakes had just gotten a whole lot higher. "What now?" she asked Iron Jack as they watched Tommy reunite with his relieved father. The marshal's face was grim in the moonlight. Now we prepare for war. Hawkins won't take this lying down. He'll come at us with everything he's got." Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. She'd tried to avoid this, tried to find a peaceful solution, but Hawkins and his gang had made their choice. Now it was time for the lightning hand to show them exactly why she had been the most feared gunslinger. In the west, as they walked back towards the center of town, Sarah's mind was already formulating plans. The Midnight Riders had brought more than just information. They had brought the catalyst that would set Tumbleweed Gulch ablaze. And Sarah McCready, baker-turned-defender, was ready to meet the fire head-on. The pre-dawn light found Sarah back in her bakery, but today she wasn't preparing bread. Her hands, usually dusted with flour, now worked swiftly to clean and load her revolvers. The familiar weight of the guns brought a flood of memories. Some welcome, others she'd rather forget. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, not looking up from her task. Marshal Iron Jack entered, his face grim. "Word spread about last night. Hawkins knows you're here now, and he's not happy." Sarah nodded, sliding the last bullet into place. "I expected as much. What's our next move?" Iron Jack leaned against the counter, his eyes taking in the arsenal spread across Sarah's usual workspace. "We've got a few hours before Hawkins makes his move. Need to get the town ready." As if on cue, the bakery's back door opened, and a stream of determined-looking townsfolk began to file in. Sarah recognized faces from her secret meetings. Mrs. Johnson from the quilting circle, Mr. Watkins, the blacksmith, even young Billy from the stables. "Reporting for duty, Miss Sarah," Mrs. Johnson said, her usually gentle voice steely with resolve. "Just tell us what needs doing." For a moment Sarah was speechless. These people who had welcomed her and given her a home were now ready to stand beside her against Hawkins and his gang. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. "All right," she said, straightening up. "Here's what we're going to do." Over the next few hours, Sarah's bakery became the hub of Tumbleweed Gulch's resistance. Under her guidance, the townspeople prepared for the coming battle in ways Hawkins and his men would never expect. Mrs. Johnson and her quilting circle worked on creating hidden pockets in clothing to conceal weapons and Sarah's special baking concoctions. Mr. Watkins modified everyday tools into makeshift weapons, while Billy used his knowledge of the town's layout to plan escape routes and hiding spots. Sarah moved among them, offering encouragement and instruction. Her hands, equally comfortable with rolling pins and revolvers, demonstrated techniques for using common household items as defensive tools. "Remember," she cautioned as she showed them how to use a frying pan as both shield and weapon. We're not looking to kill. Our goal is to drive Hawkins and his gang out of Tumbleweed Gulch for good." Iron Jack watched from the corner, a mixture of admiration and concern on his face. "You've turned a town of peaceful folks into a militia," he observed quietly when Sarah passed near him. "I've given them a way to defend their homes," Sarah corrected. "Sometimes, Marshal, the law needs a little help from the people it's meant to protect." As the sun climbed higher, the bakery began to empty, each person heading out with a specific task. Soon, only Sarah, Iron Jack, and Sheriff Thompson remained. "You really think this will work?" Thompson asked, his voice betraying his doubt. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "It has to. We've got one shot at this, and we need to make it count." Iron Jack nodded, his hand resting on his holstered gun. "Hawkins won't know what hit him. But Sarah," he added, his voice low, "if things go south, if it comes down to it—" "I know," Sarah replied, her hand unconsciously moving to her own weapon. "The lightning hand might have to make an appearance after all." As the two lawmen left to take up their positions, Sarah found herself alone in her bakery. The space, usually filled with the comforting smells of bread and pastries, now carried the sharp scent of gun oil mixed with the lingering aroma of flour. She moved to the window, looking out at the town she had come to call home. Tumbleweed Gulch had given her a chance at a new life, at peace. Now it was her turn to give something back. Sarah's eyes fell on the old trunk in the corner, the one that held her past. For years, she had tried to keep the lightning hand locked away. But as the sound of approaching horses reached her ears, Sarah knew that the time for hiding was over. With a deep breath, she strapped on her gun belt, feeling the familiar weight settle around her hips. The baker and the gunslinger, flour and gunpowder, two halves of a whole, united in defense of Tumbleweed Gulch. As Hawkins and his gang rode into town, they would find not a helpless settlement ripe for plunder, but a community ready to fight back. And at its heart, a woman who had found a way to reconcile her past and present, to use all of her skills, both as Sarah the baker and as the legendary Lightning Hand, to protect the place and people she called home. The stage was set, the players in position. The battle for Tumbleweed Gulch was about to begin, and Sarah McCready was ready to show Hawkins and his gang that sometimes the deadliest weapon comes in the most unassuming package. The sun climbed, higher in the sky, baking the streets of Tumbleweed Gulch in unforgiving heat. An eerie stillness had settled over the town, broken only by the occasional creak of a shutter or the distant bark of a dog. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like any other sleepy afternoon in this dusty frontier outpost. But Sarah knew better. From her vantage point in the clock tower of the old church, she could see the entire main street stretched out. Below her, her keen eyes scanned the horizon, watching for the telltale dust cloud that would herald Hawkins' approach. "Anything?" Marshal Iron Jack's voice crackled through the crude radio system Mr. Watkins had rigged up. "Nothing yet," Sarah replied, her voice low and tense. "But they'll be here. Hawkins isn't one to back down from a fight." As she spoke, Sarah's mind raced through their preparations one last time. The town had been transformed into a maze of traps and ambush points. Every strength Hawkins thought he had, numbers, firepower, ruthlessness, had been accounted for and counted as best they could. But still, doubt gnawed at her. Had she done enough? Had she asked too much of these people who had taken her, and given her a chance at a peaceful life? A movement in her peripheral vision snapped Sarah back to the present. She raised her spyglass, focusing on a distant ridge. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw them, riders at least 24, their forms shimmering in the heat haze. "They're coming," she said into the radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. 24, maybe more, coming in from the east." Iron Jack's response was immediate. "All right, people, this is it. Remember your positions and for God's sake, stay calm. We've got one shot at this." Sarah watched as the riders drew closer, their features becoming clearer. At their head rode Silas Hawkins himself, his black duster billowing behind him like the wings of some great predatory bird. As the gang entered the outskirts of town, Sarah could see the confusion on their faces. The streets were deserted. Windows shuttered, doors barred. It was as if Tumbleweed Gulch had turned into a ghost town overnight. Hawkins reined in his horse at the edge of the main street, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene. Sarah could almost see the gears turning in his head, trying to figure out what kind of welcome or ambush awaited him. For a long moment, nothing moved. The gang sat atop their horses, hands hovering near weapons, while the hidden defenders of Tumbleweed Gulch held their collective breath. Then, with a sharp gesture from Hawkins, the outlaws began to move forward, spreading out as they entered. The town proper. Sarah's hand tightened on her rifle as she watched them pass the first set of hidden traps. "Not yet," she whispered to herself. "Wait for it." The lead riders were halfway down the main street when all hell broke loose. Mrs. Johnson's quilting circle, positioned in upper windows, unleashed a barrage of Sarah's flower bombs. The air filled with choking white clouds, disorienting the riders and spooking their horses. In the chaos that followed, more of Sarah's plans sprang into action. Ropes hidden in the dust snapped taut, sending riders tumbling from their mounts. Concentrated pockets of Sarah's sleep powder billowed up from cunningly concealed barrels, dropping outlaws where they stood. Through it all, not a single shot had been fired. The defenders of Tumbleweed Gulch were holding to Sarah's instructions: disable and disorient, but don't kill unless absolutely necessary. From her perch, Sarah could see Hawkins wheeling his horse, shouting orders that were lost in the din. His carefully planned assault had dissolved into confusion in a matter of seconds, but Sarah knew this was just the opening salvo. Hawkins hadn't become the most feared outlaw in the territory by giving up easily. The real fight was yet to come. As if reading her thoughts, Hawkins suddenly raised his arm, firing his revolver into the air. The sharp crack cut through the chaos, and his men began to regroup, finding cover where they could. "Second wave incoming," Sarah barked into the radio. "They're adapting. Be ready." She watched as Hawkins directed his men to use their fallen comrades and horses as cover. They were returning fire now, bullets pinging off buildings and shattering windows. Sarah's mind raced, calculating angles and trajectories. She had hoped to avoid bloodshed, but it was clear that Hawkins wasn't going to make that possible. "Iron Jack," she called into the radio. "I'm moving to position B, cover me." Without waiting for a response, Sarah slung her rifle over her shoulder and began to descend from the clock tower. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady. The lightning hand was awakening, ready to strike. As she reached the ground floor of the church, Sarah paused, taking a deep breath. The sounds of battle raged outside, shouts, gunfire, the crash of breaking glass. This was the moment of truth. Everything she had planned, every trap and trick had led to this. Sarah's hand moved to her hip, feeling the reassuring weight of her revolver. She had tried to solve this as Sarah the baker, using wit and cunning. But now, as bullets flew and lives hung in the balance, she knew it was time for the lightning hand to make her stand. With a final steadying breath, Sarah pushed open the church door and stepped out into the chaos of battle. Tumbleweed Gulch's fate hung in the balance, and she was ready to tip the scales. The chaos of battle engulfed Sarah as she darted from cover to cover, her eyes scanning for threats and opportunities. Gunfire echoed off the buildings, and the air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. As she rounded the corner of the general store, Sarah came face to face with one of Hawkins's men. Time seemed to slow as they locked eyes, both reaching for their weapons. But Sarah was faster, always faster. In a blur of motion, she disarmed the outlaw and knocked him unconscious with the butt of her revolver. "Still got it," she muttered, dragging the unconscious man into a nearby alley. Suddenly a voice crackled over her radio. "Sarah! We've got a problem at the bank. Hawkins is making his move," she cursed under her breath. The bank had been a key, part of their defense strategy. If Hawkins took it, they'd lose their advantage. Sarah was about to respond when a new sound cut through the din of battle, the thunderous approach of horses. For a moment, her heart sank. Had Hawkins called in reinforcements? But as she peered down the street, her eyes widened in disbelief. Riding into town was a group of men she never expected to see, the Barton gang, notorious rivals of Hawkins and his crew. At their head was Jake Barton himself, a man Sarah knew all too well from her days as the Lightning Hand. They had history, complicated and fraught, but never entirely resolved. Jake reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene before settling on Sarah. A slow grin spread across his face. Well, well, he drawled, tipping his hat. If it ain't the lightning hand herself. Heard there was some excitement in Tumbleweed Gulch. Didn't expect to find you at the center of it, darling. Sarah's mind raced. The Barton gang's presence changed everything. But were they here to help, or to take advantage of the chaos? Jake, she said cautiously, her hand never straying far from her weapon. This is a surprise. What brings you to our neck of the woods? Jake dismounted, his spurs jingling as he approached her. Let's just say we've got a vested interest in seeing Hawkins taken down a peg or two. Thought we might lend a hand. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Out of the goodness of your hearts, I'm sure. Jake laughed, a rich sound that brought back memories Sarah had long tried to forget. Now, no need to be suspicious. Enemy of my enemy and all that. Besides, he added, his voice softening slightly, I owed you one, didn't I? Before Sarah could respond, another burst of gunfire erupted from the direction of the bank. Jake's expression turned serious. Looks like you could use some help, Lightning Hand. What do you say we put the past behind us and show Hawkins what happens when he messes with the wrong town? Sarah hesitated. Trusting Jake Barton was risky. He was an outlaw after all. But his men could turn the tide of the battle, and despite their complicated history, she knew Jake was a man of his word. All right, she said finally, but we do this my way. No unnecessary bloodshed, you hear me? Jake grinned, drawing his pistols with a flourish. Wouldn't dream of disappointing you, darling. Boys, he called to his men, let's show these Hawkins boys how real outlaws fight. As the Barton gang spurred their horses into action, Sarah felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Relief at the unexpected reinforcements, worry about the unpredictability Jake brought to her carefully laid plans, and a twinge of something else. A reminder of a part of her past she'd tried to leave behind, but there was no time for reminiscing. The battle for Tumbleweed Gulch was reaching its climax, and Sarah knew that the next few minutes would determine the fate of the town. And perhaps her own future as well. With a deep breath, she nodded to Jake. Let's finish this. Together, the unlikely allies charged towards the bank, ready to confront Hawkins and end his reign of terror once and for all. The final act of Tumbleweed Gulch's drama was about to unfold, with Sarah at its center, no longer just a baker, not quite the Lightning Hand, but something new altogether. As Sarah and Jake made their way towards the bank, an eerie calm settled over Tumbleweed Gulch. The gunfire had died down, replaced by an unsettling silence that seemed to stretch time itself. It was as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for the final confrontation. Sarah motioned for Jake to stop as they reached the corner of the general store. Peering around the edge, she could see the bank's entrance. Two of Hawkins' men stood guard, their eyes darting nervously from side to side. Hawkins is inside, Sarah whispered, her mind racing through possible strategies. Probably trying to crack the safe. We need to draw him out. Jake nodded, a mischievous glint in his eye. I've got just the thing, darling. Watch and learn. Before Sarah could stop him, Jake stepped out into the open, his hands raised in an exaggerated gesture of surrender. Well, boys, he called out, his voice carrying down the street. Looks like you've got old Jake Barton dead to rights. Why don't you call your boss out here so I can surrender proper like? Sarah held her breath, torn between admiration for Jake's audacity and frustration at his recklessness. The guards exchanged confused glances before one of them disappeared inside the bank. Moments later, Silas Hawkins himself emerged, his face a mask of suspicion and barely contained rage. Barton! He spat, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. What kind of game are you playing? Jake grinned, spreading his arms wide. No game, Hawkins. Just thought I'd save you the trouble of hunting me down after you're done here. Figured we could settle our differences like gentlemen. Hawkins' eyes narrowed. You expect me to believe that? Where's the rest of your gang? Oh, they're around, Jake said casually. But this is between you and me, unless, of course, you're yellow. Sarah watched the exchange with growing tension. She could see Hawkins' men shifting nervously, unsure whether to keep their eyes on Jake or watch for an ambush. It was a perfect Distraction, but also incredibly dangerous. One wrong move, and the whole situation could explode. Slowly, carefully, Sarah began to move. Using the distraction Jake had created, she circled around behind the bank, her steps silent on the dusty ground. Through a back window, she could see more of Hawkins' men inside, working on the safe. Her mind raced, formulating a plan. If she could just get inside, she might be able to turn the tables on Hawkins before he realized what was happening. Back on the street, the confrontation between Jake and Hawkins was reaching a boiling point. "You've got a lot of nerve showing." "Up here, Barton," Hawkins growled, "after what you pulled in Red Rock." Jake's grin never faltered, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "Ancient history, Hawkins. I'm here to write a new chapter. Question is, are you man enough to face me one-on-one? Or do you need all your boys to back you up?" Hawkins' face contorted with rage. For a moment, Sarah thought he might shoot Jake where he stood. But then, to her surprise, Hawkins began to laugh. "You always were a smooth talker, Barton," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Fine. You want to settle this? Let's settle it. You and me. Right here, right now." As Hawkins began to step forward, Sarah saw her opportunity. With Hawkins and his men focused on Jake, she slipped through the back window of the bank, her movements silent and fluid. Inside, she found herself face to face with 3 of Hawkins's men, their expressions changing from surprise to fear as they recognized her. "Evening, gentlemen," Sarah said softly, her hands hovering near her holsters. "I don't suppose you'd consider surrendering quietly." Outside, she could hear Hawkins and Jake squaring off, their voices raised in challenge. The calm was about to break, and when it did, all hell would break loose. Sarah took a deep breath, centering herself. In a matter of moments, the fate of Tumbleweed Gulch would be decided. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built, in her new life, hung in the balance. As she stared down Hawkins's men, Sarah felt the last vestiges of her Baker persona fall away. The lightning hand was back, ready to fight for her home and her future. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back. The storm was about to break, and Sarah McCready was ready to ride it out. The tension in Tumbleweed Gulch was palpable, as the confrontation between Jake Barton and Silas Hawkins reached its boiling point. The 2 men stood in the middle of the street, hands hovering near their holsters, eyes locked in a deadly stare. Inside the bank, Sarah faced her own standoff with Hawkins' men. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder, a stark contrast to the usual aroma of fresh bread that had defined her life for the past few years. "Now, boys," Sarah said, her voice calm but tinged with steel, "you've got 2 choices here. You can try your luck against the lightning hand, or you can walk out of here with your lives. What's it gonna be?" The outlaws exchanged nervous glances. They had heard the stories, whispered tales of a gunslinger so fast she could draw and fire before a man could blink. But surely this unassuming Baker couldn't be that legend. Could she? Outside, Jake's voice carried through the open window. "What's the matter, Hawkins? Getting cold feet? Or maybe you're just realizing you're outmatched?" Hawkins' response was a snarl of rage. "You talk too much, Barton. Let's settle this like men." The sound of a gunshot shattered the tense silence, and chaos erupted both inside and outside the bank. Sarah moved with a speed and grace that belied her years away from gunfighting. In a blur of motion, she disarmed the first outlaw, using him as a shield against his companions. The other 2 fired wildly, their shots going wide, as Sarah's precisely aimed bullets found their marks, wounding but not killing. In a matter of seconds, all 3 men were disarmed and subdued. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. She still had it, but there was no time to savor the victory. The sounds of gunfire and shouting from the street told her that the real battle was just beginning. Sarah quickly bound the outlaws and moved to the window, assessing the situation outside. Jake and Hawkins were locked in a deadly duel, their guns blazing as they ducked and weaved between cover. Around them, the Barton gang and Hawkins' crew had turned the main street into a war zone. She spotted Marshal Ironjack and Sheriff Thompson rallying the townsfolk, using Sarah's traps and tricks to great effect against the outlaws. But it was clear that they were outnumbered and outgunned. Sarah knew she had to act fast. The fate of Tumbleweed Gulch hung in the balance, and she was the only one who could tip the scales. Taking a deep breath, Sarah checked her revolvers one last time. The weight of them in her hands felt both familiar and strange, a reminder of the life she had left behind and the new one she had built. "Well, old friends," she murmured to her guns, "looks like it's time for one last dance." With that, Sarah vaulted through the window and into the fray. The moment her boots hit the dusty street, it was as if time itself slowed down. She could see everything with crystal clarity, the arc of bullets through the air, the subtle tells of men about to shoot, the tiny openings in their defenses. The lightning hand was back, and she was a force of nature. Sarah moved through the battlefield like a ghost, her guns singing a deadly song. Every shot found its mark, disarming or disabling. Hawkins' men with surgical precision. She was a blur of motion, impossible to pin down or predict. Outlaws who had scoffed at the idea of a female gunslinger now found themselves staring in awe and terror as Sarah cut through their ranks like a hot knife through butter. In the center of it all, Jake and Hawkins continued their personal duel, oblivious to the changing tide of battle around them. Sarah could see that Jake was holding his own, but Hawkins fought with the desperate ferocity of a man with nothing to lose. As she dropped another outlaw with a well-placed shot, Sarah locked eyes with Marshal Iron Jack across the street. A moment of understanding passed between them. "This ends now," her gaze said. Iron Jack nodded, then turned to rally the townsfolk for one final push. Sarah began to make her way towards Jake and Hawkins, her mind clear and focused. She had started this by standing up to Hawkins and his gang. Now it was time to finish it. The sun hung high in the sky, bathing Tumbleweed Gulch in harsh light. It was high noon, the traditional time for settling scores in the Old West. And as Sarah advanced, her guns gleaming in the sunlight, she knew that one way or another, this would be the final showdown. The lightning hand was about to strike for the last time, and Tumbleweed Gulch would never be the same again. As Sarah made her way through the chaotic streets of Tumbleweed Gulch, the tide of battle seemed to be turning in their favor. The townsfolk, emboldened by her display of skill and courage, fought with renewed vigor. Hawkins' men were falling back, confused and demoralized by the unexpected resistance. But just as victory seemed within reach, a shout from behind caught Sarah's attention. "Sarah, look out!" She whirled around, her instincts screaming danger. To her shock, she found herself staring down the barrel of a gun held by none other than Deputy Collins, Sheriff Thompson's right-hand man. "Collins?" Sarah's voice was tight with disbelief. "What are you doing?" The deputy's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, fear, regret, and a hint of desperation. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I didn't want it to come to this, but I don't have a choice." Realization dawned on Sarah. "You're working for Hawkins." Collins nodded, his gun hand trembling slightly. "He's got my family. Said he'd kill them if I didn't help. I had to." The betrayal stung, but Sarah's mind was already racing, calculating angles and possibilities. She could see the conflict in Collins's eyes, the reluctance in his stance. He wasn't a killer, just a man backed into an impossible corner. "Collins, listen to me," Sarah said, her voice calm and steady despite the chaos around them. "I know you're scared for your family, but this isn't the way. Hawkins can't be trusted. Even if you do this, there's no guarantee he'll keep his word." The deputy's resolve seemed to waver. "But what choice do I have? I can't risk my family's lives." Sarah took a careful step forward, her hands raised placatingly. "We can protect them together. But I need you to trust me. Lower the gun and we can end this, for all of us." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Collins stood frozen, his eyes darting between Sarah and the ongoing battle around them. Then slowly, agonizingly, he began to lower his weapon, but fate had other plans. A stray bullet whizzed past, startling Collins. His finger tightened reflexively on the trigger. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Sarah saw the flash of the muzzle, felt the wind of the bullet as it passed mere inches from her head. Her body reacted on pure instinct, honed by years of gunfights and near misses. In a blur of motion, Sarah closed the distance between them. Her hand struck out, knocking the gun from Collins' grasp. In the same fluid movement, she swept his legs, out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. As Collins lay there, stunned and disarmed, Sarah knelt beside him. Her voice was gentle but firm. "I meant what I said. We'll protect your family. But right now, I need you to make a choice. Are you with us or against us?" Tears welled up in Collins' eyes as the full weight of his actions hit him. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm so sorry. Please help me make this right." Sarah nodded, offering him a hand up. "Then let's finish this. Together." As she helped Collins to his feet, Sarah's eyes scanned the battlefield. The momentary distraction had cost them. Hawkins' men, seeing their chance, had rallied and were pushing back hard. In the center of it all, Jake and Hawkins were still locked in their deadly duel, both men bloodied but unbowed. Sarah knew that's where this had to end. She turned to Collins, her expression grave. "I need you to get to Marshal Ironjack. Tell him what happened, and that we need to focus on containing Hawkins' men. Can you do that?" Collins nodded, determination, replacing the fear in his eyes. "I won't let you down again, Sarah. I swear it." As the deputy rushed off to deliver her message, Sarah took a deep breath, centering herself. The betrayal had shaken her more than she cared to admit, but there was no time for doubt or recrimination. The fate of Tumbleweed Gulch still hung. In the balance, with renewed purpose, Sarah started towards Jake and Hawkins. The final confrontation was at hand, and she knew that before the dust settled, more than one legend would be decided in the streets of this small frontier town. The lightning hand had one more storm to weather, and Sarah McCready was determined to see it through to the end, no matter the cost. The sun hung mercilessly in the sky, casting harsh shadows across Tumbleweed Gulch as Sarah made her way towards the center of the conflict. The air was thick with gun smoke and the acrid scent of spent cartridges. The once quiet streets of her adopted home had become a battlefield, and the cost was becoming painfully clear. As she moved, Sarah took stock of the situation. Bodies littered the ground, some motionless, others groaning in pain. She recognized faces on both sides, Hawkins's men, townspeople who had taken up arms, even a few of Jake's gang. The sight sent a pang through her heart. This was exactly what she had hoped to avoid. "Sarah!" a voice called out, and she turned to see Mr. Watkins, the blacksmith, limping towards her. His left arm hung useless at his side, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. "Mr. Watkins!" Sarah gasped, quickly moving to support him. "You're hurt. We need to get you to safety." The old blacksmith shook his head grimly. "No time for that, girl. Hawkins' boys, they're pushing towards the school. Mrs. Thompson and some of the kids are still holed up in there." Sarah's blood ran cold. The school had been designated as a safe zone, a place for non-combatants to take shelter. If Hawkins' men reached it— "Go," Mr. Watkins urged, seeing the conflict in her eyes. "I'll be fine. Those kids need you more than I do." With a nod of gratitude and a squeeze of his good arm, Sarah took off towards the schoolhouse. As she ran, weaving between cover and returning fire when necessary, she could hear the sounds of the main battle growing more intense. Jake and Hawkins were still going at it, their personal vendetta having become the focal point of the entire conflict. Sarah knew she needed to end this, to find a way to stop Hawkins once and for all, but first she had to make sure the children were safe. As she rounded the corner onto the street where the schoolhouse stood, Sarah's heart sank. 3 of Hawkins's men were already there, trying to break down the barricaded door. Inside, she could hear the frightened cries of children. Without hesitation, Sarah raised her revolvers. "Hey, boys," she called out, her voice carrying over the din of battle. "Why don't you pick on someone your own size?" The outlaws whirled, surprise turning to fear as they recognized her. Sarah didn't give them time to react. Her guns roared, the shots precisely placed to disarm rather than kill. In a matter of seconds, all 3 men were on the ground, clutching wounded arms or legs. As Sarah approached the schoolhouse, the door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Thompson's pale face. "Sarah, is it really you?" "It's me," Sarah confirmed quickly, ushering the teacher and children out. "We need to move. It's not safe here anymore." As they hurried down the street towards the church, which had been set up as a secondary safe house, Sarah's mind raced. The situation was spiraling out of control. Too many people were getting hurt. She had to find a way to end this, and fast. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the town. Sarah's head snapped around to see a plume of smoke rising from the direction of the bank. Her heart leapt into her throat. That's where Jake and Hawkins had been fighting. Get to the church, she ordered Mrs. Thompson. Bar the doors and don't open them for anyone but me or Marshal Ironjack. Understood? As the teacher nodded and hurried the children along, Sarah took off towards the site of the explosion. The street seemed to blur around her as she ran, her mind filled with terrible possibilities. Had Jake gotten desperate and used dynamite? Had Hawkins had an ace up his sleeve? As she neared the bank, the scene that greeted her made her blood run cold. The front of the building had been blown wide open. Debris littered the street, and small fires burned here and there, and in the middle of it all 2 figures lay motionless on the ground. Sarah approached cautiously, her guns at the ready. As the smoke cleared, she could make out Jake's familiar form, sprawled awkwardly near what used to be the bank's entrance. And a few feet away, half buried under a pile of rubble, was Silas Hawkins. The streets of Tumbleweed Gulch had indeed run red, and as Sarah stood there surveying the destruction, she couldn't help but wonder, even if they won this battle, at what cost? And could the peaceful life she had built here ever be reclaimed after such violence? With a heavy heart, Sarah steeled herself for what was to come. The battle might be nearing its end, but she knew the real struggle, that of healing and rebuilding. I was only just beginning. The dust from the explosion at the bank had barely settled when Sarah heard a commotion coming from the direction of her bakery. Her heart sank as she realized that the battle was far from over. With one last glance at the motionless forms of Jake and Hawkins, she set off towards her shop, praying she wasn't too late. As she approached, Sarah could see a group of Hawkins' men surrounding her bakery. They were shouting and firing wildly. At the building, where a group of townspeople had apparently taken refuge, she recognized Mrs. Johnson's voice, calling out defiantly from inside. "You boys better think twice before you take another step. We've got more than rolling pins in here." Sarah couldn't help but smile at the old woman's bravery. But she knew that without help, the townspeople wouldn't stand a chance against the ardent outlaws. Moving silently from cover to cover, Sarah made her way closer to the scene. She counted 6 of Hawkins' men, all heavily armed and looking more desperate by the minute. With their leader potentially dead or incapacitated, they were like wounded animals, unpredictable and dangerous. Sarah took a deep breath, centering herself. This was it, the final stand. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built in Tumbleweed Gulch came down to this moment. Stepping out from behind an overturned wagon, Sarah called out, her voice ringing clear and strong over the chaos. "That's enough, boys. This ends now." The outlaws whirled to face her, their expressions a mixture of fear and disbelief as they recognized the lightning hand. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, with a yell of rage, one of the men raised his gun. Sarah's hands moved in a blur, her revolver seeming to materialize in her grasp. 2 shots rang out in quick succession, and the outlaw's gun went flying, along with his hat. "Next one. Won't be a warning," Sarah said calmly, her eyes scanning the group. "Drop your weapons and walk away. This is your last chance." For a tense moment, Sarah thought they might actually listen. But then, with a shared glance, the remaining outlaws opened fire. The world narrowed to a pinpoint focus as Sarah's instincts took over. She moved with inhuman speed and grace, her bullets finding their marks with unerring precision. Guns flew from hands, hats were shot off heads, and in a matter of seconds 4 more of Hawkins' men were disarmed and on the ground. The last outlaw, standing, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, looked at Sarah with a mixture of awe and terror. His gun clattered to the ground as he raised his hands in surrender. "Who? What are you?" he stammered. Sarah holstered her smoking revolver, her voice tinged with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I'm just a baker who's had enough of bullies thinking they can take whatever they want." As if on cue, the bakery door burst open, and Mrs. Johnson emerged, wielding a rolling pin like a club. Behind her, other townspeople poured out, armed with whatever makeshift weapons they had been able to find. "Sarah!" Mrs. Johnson cried, rushing forward to embrace her. "You did it! You saved us all!" But even as the townspeople cheered, Sarah's I scanned the street. The battle might be won, but the war wasn't over yet. Somewhere out there, the remnants of Hawkins' gang were still at large, and the fate of Jake and Hawkins himself remained uncertain as the adrenaline of the fight began to fade. Sarah felt the weight of everything that had happened settle on her shoulders. The peaceful life she had built, the anonymity she had cherished, it was all gone now. The lightning hand was no longer a secret, and Sarah knew that her life and the life of Tumbleweed Gulch would never be the same. Marshal Iron Jack appeared from around the corner, his face grim but respectful as he surveyed the scene. "Looks like you've been busy, Miss McCready," he said, tipping his hat to her. Sarah nodded tiredly. "It's not over yet, Marshal. We've still got wounded to tend to. And there might be more of Hawkins' men out there." As the Marshal began organizing the townspeople to secure the prisoners and search for any remaining outlaws, Sarah found herself drawn back towards her bakery. The simple wooden building, with its faded sign and flour-dusted windows, seemed like a relic from another life. She placed her hand on the sun-warmed wood of the door, feeling the familiar texture beneath her fingers. In that moment, Sarah McCready, baker, gunslinger, protector of Tumbleweed Gulch, allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The battle was won, but as she looked out at the smoke-filled streets and the faces of her neighbors, forever changed by the violence they had witnessed, Sarah knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Somehow, she would have to find a way to reconcile the lightning hand with the life she had built here, and help her adopted home heal from the scars of this terrible day. With a deep breath, Sarah straightened her shoulders and turned back to face the town. There was work to be done, and whatever the future held, she would face it head-on, just as she always had. As the dust began to settle over Tumbleweed Gulch, Sarah found herself standing amidst the aftermath of the battle. The town she had come to call home bore the scars of the day's violence. Bullet-riddled buildings, overturned wagons, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. But there was no time to dwell on the destruction. Reports were coming in of a group of Hawkins men who had regrouped on the outskirts of town. They were making a last stand, holding several townspeople hostage in the old livery stable. Sarah knew this was it, the final confrontation that would determine the fate of Tumbleweed Gulch. As she checked her revolvers one last time, she felt a presence beside her. It was Marshal Iron Jack, his face grim but determined. "You don't have to do this alone, Sarah," he said quietly. "We can gather some men, form a posse." Sarah shook her head, cutting him off. "No, Marshal. I started this, and I need to finish it. Besides," she added with a grim smile, "they're expecting an army. They won't be prepared for one woman." Iron Jack studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but I'll be damned if I let you walk into that hornet's nest without backup. I'll position some men around the perimeter, out of sight. If things go south—" "They won't," Sarah assured him, though her heart raced at the thought of what she was about to do. As she made her way towards the livery stable, Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. The baker she had been for the past few years seemed to fade away, replaced by the cool, calculated focus of the lightning hand. The stable came into view, and Sarah could see two of Hawkins' men standing guard outside. They spotted her approaching and raised their rifles. "That's far enough," one of them shouted. "One more step and we start shooting hostages." Sarah raised her hands slowly, her voice carrying across the yard. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to talk to whoever's in charge." There was a moment of confused silence. Then the stable doors creaked open. A man Sarah recognized as Hawkins' second-in-command, a brutal enforcer named Blackjack, stepped out. "Well, well," he drawled, a cruel smile twisting his features. "If it ain't the famous Lightning Hand herself. Come to surrender, have you?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I've come to end this one way or another. You boys have lost. Hawkins is down. Most of your gang is either dead or in custody. There's no reason for anyone else to get hurt today." Blackjack's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, but then his expression hardened. "Nice try, lady, but we ain't buying it. We've still got hostages, which means we've still got leverage. So here's how this is gonna go." His words were cut off by a sound that made everyone freeze, the terrified cry of a child from inside the stable. In that split second of distraction, Sarah made her move. Her hands dropped to her holsters, drawing both revolvers in a motion too fast for the eye to follow. Time seemed to slow as the lightning hand lived up to her name. 2 shots rang out in quick succession, disarming the guards before they could even register what was happening. As they stumbled back in shock, Sarah was already moving, her body flowing like water around Blackjack's belated grab for his own weapon. A well-placed elbow to his solar plexus drove the air from Blackjack's lungs, and as he doubled over, Sarah brought the butt of her revolver down on the back of his head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he hit the dirt. Without missing a beat, Sarah kicked open the stable doors, her guns at the ready. Inside, she found a group of terrified townspeople huddled in a corner, guarded by 3 more of Hawkins' men who looked utterly unprepared for her sudden appearance. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, her voice cold as steel, "I suggest you drop your weapons, now." For a tense moment, nobody moved. Then slowly, one by one, the outlaws lowered their guns to the ground. As Marshal Ironjack and his men rushed in to secure the prisoners and free the hostages, Sarah felt the adrenaline begin to ebb away. It was over. They had won. But as she looked around at the frightened faces of her neighbors, at the destruction that had been wrought on her adopted home, Sarah knew that the real work was just beginning. The lightning hand had struck for the last time, but Sarah McCready's fight to protect and heal Tumbleweed Gulch was far from over. With a deep breath, she holstered her revolvers and stepped forward to help the shaken hostages to their feet. There would be time for rest and reflection later. For now, there were wounds to tend, both physical and emotional, and a town to put back together. The legend of the Lightning Hand might have been reborn today, but it was Sarah McCready, baker, neighbor, protector, who would see Tumbleweed Gulch through the difficult days ahead. The days following the Battle of Tumbleweed Gulch were a blur of activity. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, no longer able to hide behind the facade of a simple baker. The town buzzed with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and more than a little fear, as the full story of the Lightning Hand's presence among them spread. Sarah spent her days helping to rebuild, tending to the wounded, and doing her best to restore some semblance of normalcy to the shattered community. Her bakery, miraculously spared from major damage, became a hub for relief efforts. The scent of fresh bread once again wafted through the air, a comforting reminder of simpler times. But even as life in Tumbleweed Gulch began to settle, Sarah could feel the weight of expectation and speculation pressing down on her. Whispers followed her wherever she went. "Did you hear? They say she took down 10 of Hawkins' men without breaking a sweat. I heard she can shoot a playing card in half from 100 paces. They're saying outlaws all over the territory are shaking in their boots, knowing the Lightning Hand is back." Sarah did her best to ignore the talk, focusing instead on the work at hand. But she couldn't help noticing the way some people flinched when she moved too quickly, or how mothers pulled their children a little closer when she passed by. It was on one such day, as Sarah was delivering bread to families still repairing their homes, that she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. "It's only a matter of time," a man's voice said in hushed tones. "You mark my words. Every gunslinger and outlaw from here to Mexico will be coming to test themselves against the Lightning Hand. And when they do, it'll be Tumbleweed Gulch that pays the price." "Hush now," a woman replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "She saved us all. We owe her our lives." "Maybe so," the man conceded, "but at what cost? How long before—" He fell silent as Sarah rounded the corner, nearly running into them. The couple, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, looked at her with a mixture of embarrassment and fear. "Good afternoon," Sarah said softly, holding out a loaf of bread. "I brought this for you. I know you've been working hard on repairs." Mrs. Anderson took the bread with a forced smile. "Thank you, Miss McCready. You're too kind." An awkward silence fell over them. Sarah could see the unasked questions in their eyes, the barely concealed apprehension. With the heavy heart, she bid them goodbye and continued on her rounds. As the sun began to set, Sarah found herself wandering to the edge of town. She stood there, watching the colors paint the sky, lost in thought. The Andersons' conversation played over and over in her mind. Were they right? Had she put Tumbleweed Gulch in danger simply by being there? "Penny, for your thoughts." A gruff voice interrupted her reverie. Marshal Iron Jack approached, his spurs jingling softly with each step. Sarah sighed, gesturing vaguely towards the town. "I'm wondering if I've done more harm than good, Marshal. The danger's past, but the fear remains. And now there's talk of other gunslingers coming, looking to make a name for themselves." Iron Jack was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "Fear and gossip are like wildfires, Sarah. They spread fast and burn hot, but they can't last forever. Give it time. These people know what you did for them. They'll remember that long after the excitement dies down. And if trouble does come—" "Looking for me?" Sarah asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her. The marshal's hand rested on his holstered gun, a grim smile on his face. "Then they'll find more than they bargained for. You're not alone in this, Sarah. Tumbleweed Gulch takes care of its own." As they stood there, watching the last light fade from the sky, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges she couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time since the battle, she felt that perhaps there was a future for her here after all. The legend of the Lightning Hand had been reborn, for better or worse. Now it was up to Sarah to shape what that legend would become. As she turned back towards town, towards the life she had built and the people she had come to care for, Sarah McCready made a silent vow. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on, not just as the Lightning Hand, but as a member of the community she had fought so hard to protect. The whispers might continue, the fears might linger, but Sarah was determined to show Tumbleweed Gulch and herself that the Lightning Hand could be more than just a harbinger of violence. She could be a protector, a builder, a force for good in a world that so often seemed determined to tear itself apart. As she walked back into town, Sarah's resolve strengthened with each step. The smell of fresh bread still hung in the air, mingling, now with the scent of sawdust from ongoing repairs. It was a reminder of the duality of her life now, the baker and the gunslinger, existing side by side. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new whispers, and perhaps new dangers. But tonight, as Sarah returned to her bakery to prepare for another day of serving her community, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever the future held, Tumbleweed Gulch was her home, and she would do whatever it took to keep it safe. One loaf of bread, one act of kindness, and if necessary, one perfectly aimed shot at a time. The Lightning Hand had struck to save Tumbleweed Gulch. Now Sarah McCready would work tirelessly to heal it. A week after the battle, Mayor Whitaker called for a town meeting. The atmosphere in the crowded church was tense as Sarah took her seat near the back, acutely aware of the sideways glances and hushed whispers that followed her. Mayor Whitaker cleared his throat, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a solemn gravity. "Friends, neighbors, we've been through a terrible ordeal, but thanks to the bravery of many, especially Miss Sarah McCready, we've come out the other side." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Sarah could sense an undercurrent of unease. "However," the mayor continued, "recent events have raised some concerns among our community. I think it's time we address them openly." Sarah's heart sank. She knew this moment would come, but facing it was another matter entirely. Old Pete was the first to speak up, his voice quavering with age and emotion. "We are grateful for what you did, Miss Sarah. Lord knows we are. But, well, folks are scared that trouble might follow you here." Sarah stood facing her neighbors. The faces looking back at her were a mix of gratitude, fear, and uncertainty. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I understand your fears," she began. "I've spent years running from who I was, trying to leave the Lightning Hand behind. I came to Tumbleweed Gulch looking for peace, for a place to belong, and I found it here, among you." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the room. "I won't pretend that my presence here doesn't bring risks, but I want you to know that everything I did, everything I am, is dedicated to protecting this town and the people in it." Mrs. Johnson stood up, her usually gentle face set in determined lines. I, for one, feel safer knowing Sarah's here. She didn't bring trouble to our doors. Hawkins and his ilk did that. Sarah gave us the means to fight back. This sparked a heated debate. Some voiced their support for Sarah, while others expressed their fears about the future. The discussion raged on, with Sarah standing silently, accepting both the praise and the criticism. Finally, Marshal Ironjack stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding attention. "Folks, I've spent my life upholding the law in towns across this territory. I've seen communities torn apart by fear and suspicion, but I've also seen what can happen when people stand together." He turned to face Sarah, a hint of a smile on his weathered face. "Miss McCready here. She's not just the lightning hand. She's the woman who's baked your bread, shared your joys and sorrows, and when the time came, put her life on the line for every single one of you. That's the kind of neighbor any town would be lucky to have." A hush fell over the church as Ironjack's words sank in. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat, moved by the marshal's unexpected support. Mayor Whitaker seized the moment. "I propose. We put it to a vote. All in favor of Sarah McCready remaining a part of our community, say aye." The response was immediate and overwhelming. "Aye!" rang out from nearly every voice in the church, the sound swelling until it seemed the very rafters shook with it. As the meeting adjourned, people crowded around Sarah. There were handshakes, hugs, and more than a few tearful thank yous. The fear wasn't gone entirely. Sarah could still see it lingering in some eyes, but it had been overshadowed by something stronger: acceptance. Later that evening, as Sarah stood in her bakery preparing dough for the next day's bread, she heard a knock at the door. It was Tommy, the sheriff's young son, clutching a piece of paper. "Miss Sarah," he said, his voice filled with excitement, "I drew this for you." Sarah unfolded the crude drawing to see a figure in a cape, lightning bolts surrounding her, standing protectively over a group of stick figures labeled Tumbleweed Gulch. "It's you," Tommy explained unnecessarily. "The lightning hand protecting us all." As Sarah thanked the boy, her voice thick with emotion, she realized that something fundamental had shifted. The lightning hand was no longer a secret to be hidden or a past to be ashamed of. It had become a symbol of hope and protection for Tumbleweed Gulch. That night, as she hung Tommy's drawing on her wall, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The town had faced its fears and made its choice. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. The lightning hand had found her home at last. As life in Tumbleweed Gulch settled into a new normal, Sarah found herself grappling with the weight of her newly public identity. The town had accepted her, but questions about her past still lingered. She knew it was time to confront the truth head-on. One quiet evening, Sarah invited Marshal Ironjack, Sheriff Thompson, and Mayor Whitaker to her bakery after hours. As men arrived, curiosity evident on their faces as they settled around the wooden table where Sarah usually kneaded her dough. "Gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nerves, "I owe you the full story. You've trusted me, stood by me, and it's time you knew the truth about the lightning hand." She took a deep breath and began her tale. She spoke of her childhood on a small ranch, learning to shoot from her father, a former cavalry officer. She recounted her first encounter with injustice, a gang of rustlers who killed her parents and burned their home. "I was just 16, Sarah said softly, lost in the memory. "Too young to know better, too angry to care. I set out for revenge, and I found it." The men listened in rapt silence as Sarah unfolded the story of her transformation from a grief-stricken girl to the legendary lightning hand. She spoke of the lives she'd taken, the battles she'd fought, and the reputation she'd built. "But it was the incident in Dodge City that changed everything," Sarah continued, her voice heavy with regret. "A shootout gone wrong. Innocent people caught in the crossfire. Children." She trailed off, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Ironjack leaned forward, his gruff voice gentler than usual. "That's why you gave it all up? Came here to be a baker?" Sarah nodded. "I couldn't bear the weight of it anymore. The violence, the death. I wanted to create something, to nurture instead of destroy. Baking, it was as far from my old life as I could get." Mayor Whitaker shook his head in wonder. "All this time, we never suspected." "You hid it well, Sarah." I had to, Sarah replied. I was running from myself as much as from anyone else, but now... She gestured around the bakery, at the town beyond its walls. Now I realize that maybe I was meant to find this place. To find a way to use what I am, what I can do, for something good. Sheriff Thompson, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Does this mean you're taking up the guns again, permanently? Sarah considered the question carefully. Not in the way I used to. I can't go back to that life. But I can't pretend I'm not the lightning hand either. I think there's a balance to be found, a way to be both Sarah the baker and the protector this town needs. The men exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Iron Jack spoke for them all. Well, Miss McCready, I reckon Tumbleweed Gulch is lucky to have you, baker and gunslinger both. Your secret's safe with us, but know this, you're not alone anymore. Whatever comes, we face it together. As the meeting concluded and the men took their leave, Sarah felt as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The truth was out, at least to those who needed to know it most. She had faced her past and found acceptance not just from the town, but from herself. Later that night, as she stood at her window looking out over the quiet streets of Tumbleweed Gulch, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from a vengeful young girl to a legendary gunslinger, and, now to this, a baker with a deadly skill set and a town to protect. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Sarah McCready felt truly at peace. She had found her place, a perfect blend of her past and present. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with flour-dusted hands and a steady aim, ready to bake or battle as Tumbleweed Gulch required. The lightning hand had not disappeared, but had instead found a new purpose. And Sarah, both baker and guardian, was finally home. The weeks following Sarah's revelation to the town's leaders were marked by a cautious optimism. Life in Tumbleweed Gulch continued its steady rhythm, but there was an underlying current of change. Sarah found herself navigating a delicate balance between her roles as the town's baker and its unofficial protector. One crisp autumn morning, as Sarah was pulling a batch of sourdough from the oven, the bakery's bell chimed. She looked up to see a face she never expected to encounter again, Jake Barton, the outlaw who had come to her aid during the battle with Hawkins' gang. "Mornin', lightning hand," Jake drawled, tipping his hat. "Or should I say mornin', Miss Baker?" Sarah tensed, her hand instinctively moving towards the rolling pin on her counter. "Jake, what brings you to Tumbleweed Gulch?" Jake held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Easy now, I come in peace. Word spread about what happened here. Got me thinking about a lot of things." Sarah relaxed slightly but remained wary. "And what things would those be?" "Redemption, mainly," Jake replied, his usual bravado faltering for a moment. "You found a way to make peace with your past, to use your skills for something good. Got me wondering if maybe there's hope for an old outlaw like me." Before Sarah could respond, Marshal Ironjack burst through the door, his hand on his holster. "Everything all right here, Sarah? Saw this ne'er-do-well enter and thought, 'It's okay, Marshal,'" Sarah interjected quickly. "Jake and I were just having a conversation." Ironjack's eyes narrowed as he looked between Sarah and Jake. "A conversation, eh? Well, don't let me interrupt, but I'll be right outside if you need me." As the marshal reluctantly left, Sarah turned, back to Jake. "You were saying something about redemption?" Jake nodded, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "I've been running with my gang for so long, I forgot there might be another way to live. Seeing you here, respected and at peace, it's got me thinking maybe it's time for a change." Sarah studied Jake carefully, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, she asked, "What exactly are you proposing, Jake?" "I want to turn myself in," Jake said, the words seeming to surprise even him. "Face up to what I've done. Maybe find a way to make amends, like you have." The bakery fell silent as Sarah processed Jake's words. She thought about her own journey, the long and painful road from the lightning hand to Sarah the baker. Could Jake truly be seeking the same redemption she had found? "You understand what you're saying?" Sarah asked quietly. "Turning yourself in means facing the consequences of everything you've done. It won't be easy." Jake nodded solemnly. I reckon nothing worth doing ever is. But I'm tired, Sarah. Tired of running, tired of looking over my shoulder. If there's a chance for a different life, I want to take it. Sarah's mind raced. Jake's decision could have far-reaching consequences, not just for him, but for the entire territory. His testimony could bring down several outlaw gangs, making the frontier safer for everyone. All right, Sarah said finally. If you're serious about this, I'll speak to Marshal Iron Jack. But Jake, she added, her voice taking on a steely edge, if this is some kind of trick— It's not, Jake interrupted, meeting her gaze steadily. I swear it on my mother's grave. Sarah nodded, then called for the marshal. As Iron Jack entered, his hand still hovering near his gun, Sarah explained the situation. The marshal's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he listened intently. Well, I'll be damned, Iron Jack muttered when Sarah finished. He turned to Jake, his expression a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. You sure about this, Barton? No going back once you start down this road. Jake straightened his shoulders, a flicker of his old confidence returning. I'm sure, Marshal. Reckon it's about time Jake Barton did something right for a change. As Iron Jack began to read Jake his rights, Sarah felt a complex swirl of emotions. She knew all too well the difficult path Jake was choosing, the challenges and pain that lay ahead. But she also knew the peace that came with redemption, the freedom found in facing one's past. Looking at Jake's determined face, Sarah silently wished him strength for the journey ahead. Redemption, she knew, came at a high price. But as she glanced around her bakery, at the life she had built in Tumbleweed Gulch, she knew it was a price worth paying. As Marshal Iron Jack led Jake away, Sarah returned to her baking, her hands working the dough with practiced ease. The future, always uncertain, seemed to hold new possibilities. For Jake, for Tumbleweed Gulch, and for Sarah herself, the lightning hand had struck once more, not with violence, but with the power of example. And in doing so, she had set in motion changes that would ripple far beyond the borders of their small frontier town. As autumn gave way to winter, Tumbleweed Gulch found itself transformed. The town had not only recovered from Hawkins' attack, but seemed to be thriving. New businesses were opening, and there was talk of expanding the schoolhouse. Sarah's bakery remained at the heart of it all, a warm refuge against the chill prairie winds. But with prosperity came new challenges. Word of the Lightning Hand's presence in Tumbleweed Gulch had spread far and wide. While some saw it as a deterrent to trouble, others viewed it as a challenge. Marshal Iron Jack had his hands full, turning away gunslingers and thrill-seekers, looking to make a name for themselves. One frosty morning, as Sarah was setting out fresh pies to cool, she noticed an unusual commotion on the street. A stagecoach had pulled up in front of the hotel, which wasn't uncommon, but the reaction of the townsfolk was. People were gathering, pointing and whispering. Curiosity piqued, Sarah stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. As she approached, the crowd parted, revealing a sight that made her blood run cold. Stepping down from the stagecoach was a face she hadn't seen in years, one she'd hoped never to see again. Jedediah Deadeye Durham, the man who had taught her to shoot, who had set her on the path to becoming the Lightning Hand. Deadeye's eyes scanned the crowd, finally settling on Sarah. A slow, predatory smile spread across his weathered face. Well, he drawled loud enough for everyone to hear. If it ain't my star pupil. Heard you'd gone soft, girl. Turned in your guns for an apron. Say it ain't so. Sarah stood her ground, acutely aware of the eyes of the entire town upon her. Hello, Deadeye, she said evenly. What brings you to Tumbleweed Gulch? The old gunslinger chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Can't a teacher check in on his prized student, especially when he hears she's forgotten everything he taught her? The tension in the air was palpable. Sarah could feel the fear emanating from the townsfolk, could see the questions in their eyes. This was the moment she had dreaded, the past she had tried so hard to leave behind, coming back to haunt her. But as she stood there, facing the man who had shaped her into the Lightning Hand, Sarah realized something. She wasn't that angry, vengeful girl anymore. Tumbleweed Gulch had changed her, had given her a home and a purpose beyond the gun. I haven't forgotten, Deadeye, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed street. I've learned. There's more to life than being the fastest draw, more to strength than how many notches you have on your gun. Deadeye's eyes narrowed dangerously. Sounds like weakness to me, girl. Seems you need a reminder of who you really are. His hand moved towards his holster, and the crowd gasped. But Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step forward, her hands open at her sides. "Who I am," she said firmly, "is Sarah McCready. I'm a baker, a neighbor, a friend. And yes, I'm also the lightning hand, but that doesn't mean what you think it means, not anymore." She gestured to the town around them. "These people, this place, they've shown me there's another way to be strong, to protect. You taught me how to take lives, Deadeye. Here, I've learned how to save them." For a long moment, silence reigned. Deadeye's hand hovered near his gun, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Then slowly he let his arm fall to his side. "You've changed, girl," he said, a hint of something like respect in his voice. "Don't know if I'd call it for the better, but you've changed," Sarah nodded. "I have. And if you've come here looking for the lightning hand of old, you won't find her. But if you're willing to learn a new way, like I have—" She left the offer hanging in the air. Deadeye considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Reckon this new world ain't for me, girl, but I'm glad to see you found your place in it." With that, he tipped his hat, climbed back into the stagecoach, and was gone as quickly as he had arrived. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Marshal Iron Jack, his eyes twinkling with pride. "That," he said, "was some mighty fine shooting, Miss McCready. Didn't even need to draw your gun." Sarah smiled, feeling the last shadows of her past fade away. She had faced her old mentor and stood her ground, not with violence, but with the strength she had found in Tumbleweed Gulch. As she returned to her bakery, greeted by the comforting smells of fresh bread and warm pie, Sarah knew that a new chapter had begun. The lightning hand would always be a part of her, but now it was tempered by wisdom, compassion, and the love of a community. Tumbleweed Gulch had not only accepted her past, but had helped her forge a new future. And for Sarah McCready, baker and protector, that future looked brighter than ever. Spring had come to Tumbleweed Gulch, bringing with it new growth and a sense of renewal. The town had flourished in the months since Hawkins' defeat, and Sarah's dual role as baker and protector had become an accepted part of daily life. But as the snow melted and the days grew longer, a shadow fell over the town's newfound peace. Rumors began to circulate of a new threat gathering on the horizon. A coalition of outlaws, led by some of the West's most notorious gunslingers, was said to be planning something big. And Tumbleweed Gulch, home of the legendary Lightning Hand, was their prime target. Sarah first heard the whispers from Jake Barton, who had become an invaluable source of information since turning himself in. His connections in the outlaw world were proving useful in keeping Tumbleweed Gulch safe. "They're calling themselves the Deadlock Gang," Jake told Sarah and Marshal Ironjack during one of their regular meetings. "It's a who's who of the worst. Outlaws in the territory. And they're coming here, Sarah. They want to take down the Lightning Hand once and for all." Sarah's face remained impassive, but inside, her mind was racing. She had known this day might come, had prepared for it as best she could, but the reality of it still hit her like a punch to the gut. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady. Jake shook his head grimly. "At least 20, maybe more, led by Black Bill Hawkins, Silas's older brother. He's meaner, smarter, and out for revenge," Marshal Ironjack cursed under his breath. "We can't face those odds alone. We need to call for help, maybe get the army involved." But Sarah was already shaking her head. "By the time help arrives, it'll be too late. They'll have destroyed the town and moved on. No, we need to face this ourselves." The marshal looked at her incredulously. "Sarah, this isn't like before. We're talking about hardened killers, not just some gang looking to make a quick score. The town's not ready for this kind of fight." Sarah's eyes blazed with determination. "Then we'll make them ready. We've done it before. We can do it again. Tumbleweed Gulch is stronger than you think, Marshal." As they debated strategy late into the night, Sarah's mind drifted to the town she had come to love, the faces of her neighbors, the children she watched grow, the life she had built here. All of it was at stake. She knew what had to be done. The next morning, Sarah called a town meeting. Standing before her friends and Neighbors in the crowded church, she laid out the situation in stark terms. "I won't lie to you," she said, her voice carrying to the back of the room. "What's coming is dangerous, probably the most dangerous thing this town has ever faced, and it's coming because of me." A murmur ran through the crowd, but Sarah held up her hand for silence. "I know some of you might be thinking it would be easier if I just left, drew the danger away from Tumbleweed Gulch. And if that's what you want, I'll do it. This town, your safety, means everything to me." For a moment the church was silent. Then, to Sarah's surprise, old Pete stood up, his voice quavering but strong. "Now you listen here, Sarah McCready. You're one of us, has been since the day you first fired up that oven of yours. We don't turn our backs on our own." A chorus of agreement rose from the crowd. Mayor Whitaker stepped forward, his face set with determination. "Miss Sarah, you've protected us time and again, taught us to protect ourselves. If trouble's coming, we'll face it together." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes as she looked out at the resolute faces of her adopted family. This, she realized, was what she'd been fighting for all along, not just a place to hide, but a home worth defending. "All right then," she said, a smile breaking through her serious demeanor. "Let's get to work. We've got a town to defend." Over. The next week, Tumbleweed Gulch transformed. Under Sarah's guidance, the town became a fortress. Barricades were erected, escape routes planned, and every citizen was given a role in the town's defense. Sarah split her time between strategic planning, with Marshal Ironjack, and training the townsfolk. Her bakery became a hub of activity, with the scent of gunpowder mingling with that of fresh bread as she taught basic marksmanship between batches of rolls. As the day of the expected attack drew near, a tense anticipation filled the air. Sarah found herself standing at the edge of town, watching the sunset on what might be Tumbleweed Gulch's last peaceful evening. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. Marshal Iron Jack joined her, his weathered face etched with concern. "You sure about this, Sarah? There's still time to get the women and children out, at least." Sarah shook her head, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "This is their home too, Marshal. They have as much right to defend it as anyone. Besides," she added with a grim smile, "some of those women shoot better than half your deputies." Iron Jack chuckled despite the gravity of the situation. "Can't argue with that. Well, whatever happens tomorrow, it's been an honor serving with you, Lightning Hand." Sarah turned to him, extending her hand. "The honor's been mine, Marshal, and it's Sarah, just Sarah." As they shook hands, a cry went up from the town's lookout. In the fading light, a cloud of dust could be seen on the horizon. The Deadlock gang had arrived. Sarah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. This was it, the moment that would define not just her fate, but the fate of everyone in Tumbleweed Gulch. As she walked back into town, past the determined faces of her friends and neighbors, Sarah felt a calm settle over her. The Lightning Hand was ready for one last strike. But this time, she wouldn't be fighting alone. This time, she had a whole town standing with her, ready to face whatever came their way. As night fell on Tumbleweed Gulch, Sarah McCready prepared to make her final stand. Not as a lone gunslinger, but as part of something far greater than herself. Dawn broke over Tumbleweed Gulch, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. But the beauty of the sunrise was lost on the town's inhabitants as they took up their positions, weapons at the ready. The Deadlock gang had camped just beyond the town limits overnight, their campfires visible in the darkness. Now, as the new day began, so too would the battle for Tumbleweed Gulch's survival. Sarah stood on the roof of her bakery, which had become the de facto command center. From here, she could see the entire town laid out before her, the familiar streets now transformed into a battlefield. Her hands, usually dusted with flour, now gripped her twin revolvers, the weight both comforting and terrifying. "They're moving!" Marshal Ironjack's voice crackled over the crude radio system Mr. Watkins had rigged up. "Looks like they're splitting into 3 groups." Sarah nodded, even though the Marshal couldn't see her. "Just like we expected, everyone remembers the plan?" A chorus of affirmatives came back over the radio. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "All right, folks, remember we're not just fighting for our lives here, we're fighting for our home, for our future. Let's show these outlaws what Tumbleweed Gulch is made of. As if on cue, the first shots rang out. The Deadlock gang had begun their assault, their war cries echoing through the morning air. But Tumbleweed Gulch was ready. The first wave of attackers found themselves mired in quicksand traps that Mr. Watkins had ingeniously disguised. As they struggled, Mrs. Johnson and her quilting circle rained down a barrage of Sarah's special flower bombs, blinding and disorienting the outlaws. On the east side of town, a group of Deadlock members attempting to flank the defenders suddenly found themselves face to face with Old Pete and his retirement club, a group of elderly townsfolk who, as it turned out, were crack shots with their old hunting rifles. Sarah moved swiftly from position to position, her lightning hand speed now used not just for gunfighting, but for coordinating the town's defense. She shored up weak points, offered encouragement where it was needed, and when necessary, demonstrated why her reputation as a gunslinger was well earned. But the Deadlock gang was not easily deterred. They regrouped and pressed their attack with renewed vigor. Sarah found herself in the thick of the fighting, her revolvers blazing as she defended the town's main street. Suddenly, a booming voice cut through the chaos. "Lightning hand! Face me, you coward!" Sarah turned to see a mountain of a man striding down the street, gunning down anyone in his path. This had to be Black Bill Hawkins, the leader of the Deadlock gang. Time seemed to slow as Sarah stepped out to meet him. The sounds of battle faded away, leaving just the two of them, facing each other down like gunslingers of old. "You've led these people to their deaths," Black Bill snarled. "Their blood is on your hands." Sarah's voice was calm as she replied, "The only blood spilled today is because of your choices, Hawkins. These people are defending their home. What are you fighting for?" For a moment, uncertainty flickered in Black Bill's eyes. But then his face hardened, and his hand dropped to his holster. What happened next would be talked about in Tumbleweed Gulch for generations to come. Black Bill was fast, faster than anyone Sarah had ever faced. But the lightning hand hadn't. Lost her touch. Two shots rang out, so close together they sounded like one. Black Bill's bullet grazed Sarah's cheek, leaving a trail of fire. Sarah's shot, however, found its mark, sending the outlaw's gun flying from his hand. As Black Bill stared in disbelief at his empty hand, Sarah's second shot took him in the shoulder, dropping him to his knees. "It's over, Hawkins," Sarah said, her guns trained on the fallen outlaw. "Call off your men." For a long moment, Black Bill glared at her, hatred burning in his eyes. Then, slowly, the fight seemed to drain out of him. He nodded once, then bellowed, "Stand down, it's finished!" A stunned silence fell over Tumbleweed Gulch, broken only by the clatter of weapons as the remaining Deadlock gang members surrendered. As Marshal Iron Jack and his deputies moved to round up the prisoners, Sarah found herself surrounded by cheering townsfolk. They had done it. Against all odds, Tumbleweed Gulch had stood its ground and emerged victorious. But as Sarah looked out over the celebrating crowd, she felt a deep weariness settle into her bones. The price of victory had been high. Buildings were damaged, people were injured, and the innocent tranquility that had drawn her to this place was forever changed. Yet, as she watched neighbors helping neighbors, tending to the wounded, and already beginning the work of rebuilding, Sarah felt a spark of hope. Tumbleweed Gulch had been tested by fire, and it had emerged stronger. The town would recover, would rebuild, would go on. And Sarah McCready, the lightning hand, the baker, the protector, knew that she had finally found not just a place to hide, but a true home worth fighting for. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Sarah holstered her guns and picked up a broom. There was work to be done, and she intended to be a part of it. The legend of the lightning hand would live on, not as a tale of lone heroism, but as a story of a community coming together to defend what was theirs. In the end, that was a legacy Sarah could be proud of. 5 years had passed since the Battle of Tumbleweed Gulch, and the town had undergone a remarkable transformation. The scars of that fateful day had long since been repaired, replaced by new growth and prosperity. The legend of how a small frontier town had stood up to the notorious Deadlock gang had spread far and wide, drawing new settlers and opportunities. Sarah McCready's bakery still stood at the heart of Main Street, the aroma of fresh bread, a constant reminder of the peace they had fought so hard to protect. But the bakery was no longer just a bakery. It had become a gathering place, an unofficial town hall where people came not just for Sarah's famous sourdough, but for her wisdom and guidance. On this particular morning, Sarah stood at her counter, kneading dough for the day's baking. Her hands, still strong and skilled, moved with practiced ease. But now, alongside the calluses from years of baking, there were new marks, small scars, and roughened patches that spoke of the battles she had fought. The bell above the door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see Marshal Ironjack enter, his hat in his hands. Though his hair had grown greyer and his face more lined, his eyes still twinkled with the same sharp intelligence. "Morning, Sarah," he said, settling onto a stool at the counter. "Smells good in here as always." Sarah smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "Morning, Marshal, the usual." As she poured him a cup of coffee, Sarah noticed the envelope in his hand. "What's that you've got there?" Ironjack's expression turned serious. "It's from the governor's office. Seems word of what we've done here has reached all the way to the capital." He slid the envelope across the counter. Sarah opened it with flour-dusted fingers, her eyes widening as she read. "They want to make Tumbleweed Gulch the county seat," she breathed, looking up at Ironjack in disbelief. "And they're offering to send a permanent garrison of troops to help keep the peace." Ironjack nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Looks like your little baking experiment has turned into something bigger than any of us could have imagined, Lightning Hand." Sarah shook her head, still processing the news. "This isn't just about me, Marshal. This is about everyone in Tumbleweed Gulch. Every person who stood their ground, who believed we could be more than just another dusty frontier town." The bell chimed again, and Sarah looked up to see Mayor Whitaker enter, followed by a stream of townsfolk. It seemed news travelled fast in Tumbleweed Gulch, as always. "Is it true?" Old Pete asked, his eyes bright with excitement. "Are we really going to be the county seat?" Sarah nodded, holding up the letter. A cheer went up from the gathered crowd. As she looked at the faces of her friends and neighbours, Sarah felt a swell of emotion. These were the people who had taken in a stranger, who had stood by her when her past came calling, who had fought beside her to defend their home. Mayor Whitaker cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Folks, this is a big moment for Tumbleweed Gulch, but before we start celebrating, I think we need to hear from the woman who made all this possible." He turned to Sarah, a question in his eyes. "What do you think we should do, Miss Sarah?" Sarah felt the weight of every gaze in the room. 5 years ago, she would have shied away from this kind of attention, would have deflected the praise and responsibility. But she wasn't that person anymore. "I think," she said slowly, "that we've been given an opportunity to shape the future of not just our town, but this whole region." She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. "We've shown what can happen when people stand together, when they fight for what's right. Now we have a chance to build on that, to create something lasting." She stepped out from behind the counter, standing tall among her adopted family. "But it has to be a decision we make together. Every voice should be heard, every concern addressed. That's what makes Tumbleweed Gulch special. That's what we fought for." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Marshal Ironjack stood, raising his coffee cup in a toast. "To Tumbleweed Gulch," he said, his gruff voice filled with pride. "And to Sarah McCready, the best damn baker and peacekeeper this territory has ever seen." As the townsfolk cheered and began to discuss plans for the future, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The Lightning Hand would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She was Sarah McCready, baker and protector, friend and neighbor. She was home. Later that evening, as the sun set over Tumbleweed Gulch, Sarah stood on her bakery porch, looking out over the town. The streets were alive with celebration, the joy of a community looking forward to a bright future. A small hand slipped into hers, and Sarah looked down to see Tommy, Sheriff Thompson's son, now growing into a fine young man. "Miss Sarah," he said, his voice full of curiosity, "do you think we'll have to fight again? To protect the town?" Sarah squeezed his hand gently. I hope not, Tommy, but if we do, I know we'll face it together. That's the real strength of Tumbleweed Gulch. Not guns or forts, but the heart of its people. As darkness fell and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Sarah McCready, once the feared lightning hand, now beloved baker and guardian of Tumbleweed Gulch, knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them as they had always done, with courage, compassion, and the unbreakable spirit of a community united. The legend of the Lightning Hand had evolved into something far greater, the legend of Tumbleweed Gulch, a town that had found its strength not in weapons, but in the bonds between its people, and for Sarah that was the greatest victory of all.